When someone you love is taken from you violently, you deserve answers. You deserve justice. You deserve to look into the eyes of the person who destroyed your family and know they'll pay for what they've done. But for decades, thousands of families have lived in a different reality. Their loved ones were murdered, their cases went cold, and the killers walked free, hidden behind time, flawed investigations, and missing evidence. Mothers put their children to bed every night, not knowing if the monster who killed their husband was the neighbour next door. Sons grew into old men, still haunted by their sister's unsolved murder. These families were told to move on, to accept that justice might never come. But they refused to give up, and neither did the investigators who never stopped working these cases. Because of advances in DNA technology, dedicated cold case units, and witnesses who finally broke their silence decades later, the impossible became possible. Cases that sat frozen in filing cabinets for 20, 30, even 50 years suddenly cracked wide open. Today we're covering every major family cold case that has finally been solved. What you're about to hear will show you that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of surfacing, and justice, even when delayed, can still be served. Case number 1. On November 10th, 1985, a hunter walking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, stumbled across something that would start one of the most twisted cold cases in American history. Hidden in the woods near an old burned-down store, he found a metal 55-gallon drum. When police opened it, they discovered the bodies of a woman and a young girl, both wrapped in plastic. Doctors who examined the bodies said both victims died from being hit in the head multiple times. The woman looked like she was between 23 and 33 years old. The girl was somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. Nobody knew who they were. Police buried them in an Allenstown cemetery with a simple tombstone that read, "Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10th, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care." The case went cold almost immediately. There were no missing persons reports that matched the victims. Nobody came forward to claim them. The bodies had been in the woods long enough that investigators believed the murders happened sometime between 1977 and 1981. The woman and girl became known as the Bear Brook victims, two people who died terrible deaths and were buried without even their names to remember them by. 15 years passed. In the year 2000, a New Hampshire state trooper decided to take another look at the area where the first barrel was found. He wanted to see if there was any evidence that had been missed back in 1985. On May 9th, 2000, he made a discovery that completely changed the case. Just 300 feet away from where the first barrel had been found, he discovered another metal 55-gallon drum. Inside were the remains of 2 more young girls. The police realized something horrible. All 4 victims had probably been in those woods the entire time. The second barrel had been sitting there since 1985. Maybe even earlier, and nobody had seen it. The investigators believed all 4 murders happened around the same time, probably before 1981. DNA testing on the victims revealed important information. The adult woman was the biological mother of 2 of the girls, but the third child, who was between 2 and 4 years old when she died, was not related to them. This middle child became one of the biggest mysteries of the case. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why was she murdered alongside 3 people she had no blood connection to? For years, investigators hit dead ends. They had DNA from the victims, but DNA only helps if you have something to compare it to. Without any missing persons reports or family members looking for these 4 people, the case stayed frozen. The victims were buried, sketches of what they might have looked like were shared with the public, but nobody came forward with answers. 3 of them stayed in the Allenstown cemetery, unknown and unnamed, for decades. Everything started to change in the early 2000s because of a completely different case in California. In 2002, a man was arrested for murdering his wife, UNSOLVED. He was using the name Larry Vanner at the time, but when police started looking into his background, they realized this man had used many different names over the years. He had also been connected to a young woman he had abandoned in California back in 1986. The man claimed she was his daughter, but DNA testing proved that was a lie. She was not related to him at all. Detective Peter Headley from San Bernardino County started working on finding out who this young woman really was. In 2015, he reached out to a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter for help. Ray Venter was not a police officer or a detective. She was a retired lawyer who had become interested in using DNA to help people find their biological families. She agreed to help find the true identity of the young woman who had been abandoned. Using DNA from the woman and comparing it to genetic information on public genealogy websites, Ray Venter slowly built family trees. She looked at birth records, newspaper articles, and online family trees. It took over a year of work, but in 2016, she finally discovered the truth. The young woman's real name was Dawn Bodin. Her mother was a woman named Denise Bodin, who had disappeared from Manchester, New Hampshire, in 1981. The man who had abandoned Dawn was the last person seen with Denise. His real name was not Larry Vanner or any of the other names he used. It was Terry Peder Rasmussen. This discovery connected Rasmussen to New Hampshire at the exact same time the Bear Brook victims were murdered. Investigators started looking closer at him. They obtained DNA from his body after he died in prison in 2010, while serving time for murdering Eun Soon Jun. When they compared his DNA to the DNA of the Bear Brook victims, they made a shocking discovery. Terry Rasmussen was the biological father of the middle child, the young girl who was not related to the other 3 victims. In January 2017, police publicly announced that a man who went by the name Bob Evans was their main suspect in the Bear Brook murders. In August 2017, they revealed that Bob Evans was actually Terry Peder Rasmussen. Terry Peder Rasmussen was born on December 23, 1943 in Denver, Colorado. He dropped out of high school and joined the Navy in 1961. After being discharged in 1967, he got married and had children, but Rasmussen could not stay in one place or keep one identity for long. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, he moved constantly across the United States. Wherever he went, people disappeared. He used many fake names including Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Larry Vanner, and Gordon Jensen. Investigators believe he may have killed many more people than the ones they know about. While Ray Venter worked on identifying Rasmussen, she also started working on identifying the Bear Brook victims themselves. But this task was much harder than finding out who Rasmussen was. The bodies had been in the woods for years before they were found. The DNA samples from the victims were badly damaged. Bacteria had gotten into their bones as the bodies broke down. For a long time, scientists could only get mitochondrial DNA from the victim's hair. Mitochondrial DNA is useful, but it only passes from mothers to children. To use genetic genealogy the way Ray Venter wanted to use it, she needed autosomal DNA, which comes from both parents. There was a problem. Autosomal DNA is found inside the nucleus of cells. Once cells become part of a hair strand, the nucleus and the autosomal DNA break down into tiny pieces. Scientists believed it was impossible to get autosomal DNA from hair that did not have a living root attached. But in 2018 and 2019, a forensic lab in California developed a new method. They figured out how to take the broken bits of autosomal DNA from hair strands and put them back together, like working on a giant puzzle. After months of trying and failing and trying again, they finally got a DNA sample from the Bear Brook victims that Ray Venter could use. At the same time, another person was working on the case from a completely different angle. Rebecca Heath was a research librarian from Connecticut. She had become interested in the Bear Brook case about 10 years before the victims were identified. She spent countless hours searching the internet, looking at missing persons databases, reading old newspaper articles, and checking genealogy message boards. Heath was looking for anyone who might match the description of the Bear Brook victims. In late 2017, Heath came across an old post on an ancestry message board. Someone was looking for information about a woman named Marlise McWaters and her daughters, Sarah McWaters and Marie Vaughan. The family said Marlise had last been seen in California in late 1978 when she left with a new boyfriend. She had introduced him to her family on Thanksgiving, and then they never saw Marlise or her daughters again. The description of Marlise and her daughters seemed to match the Bear Brook victims. Heath tried to reach out on the message board, but nobody responded at first. A year later, Heath was listening to a podcast about the Bear Brook murders. When she heard details about the victims, she immediately remembered the ancestry post about Marlise McWaters and her daughters. She went back and found the post again. This time, she found an email address connected to the person who had written it. Heath sent an email asking if the person was still looking for Marlise and her daughters. Within minutes, she got a response. Heath asked for more information and photos of the missing family members. When the relatives sent pictures of Marlise and her daughters, Heath was struck by how much they looked like the sketches that had been drawn of the Bearbrook victims years earlier. Heath contacted Detective Peter Headley in California, who had been working on the Rasmussen case. Headley then contacted the New Hampshire State Police. At almost exactly the same time, in late 2018, both Heath and Ray Venter independently discovered the same thing. The three biologically related Bearbrook victims were Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch and her two daughters, Marie Elizabeth Vaughan and Sarah Lynn McWaters. Ray Venter had found them through DNA and genetic genealogy. Heath had found them through old-fashioned detective work and internet research. On June 6, 2019, New Hampshire authorities held a press conference to announce the identifications. The adult woman was 24-year-old Marlise Honeychurch, who also went by Marlise McWaters. The oldest child was her daughter, 6-year-old Marie Elizabeth Vaughan. The youngest child was her other daughter, 1-year-old Sarah Lynn McWaters. Marlise had been married twice. Marie was from her first marriage, and Sarah was from her second marriage. In November 1978, Marlise met a man at her job in California. She introduced him to her family as her new boyfriend on Thanksgiving. His name was Bob Evans. After Thanksgiving, Marlise left with Bob Evans and her two daughters. Her family never heard from them again. The man Marlise knew as Bob Evans was really Terry Rasmussen. Investigators believe Rasmussen killed Marlise, Marie and Sarah sometime between late 1978 and early 1981. He put their bodies in the two barrels and left them in the woods near Bearbrook State Park. At some point before 1981, he also killed his own daughter and put her body in the second barrel with Sarah McWaters. But investigators still did not know who the middle child was. They knew she was Rasmussen's daughter. They knew she was between 2 and 4 years old when she died. They knew she was born around 1976 or 1977, but they did not know her name or who her mother was. For 6 more years, she remained unidentified, known only as the middle child or Jane Doe. In early 2024, the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit partnered with a group called the DNA Doe Project. This organisation uses genetic genealogy to identify unknown victims. The team working on the middle child case built a massive family tree. They went back generations, looking at DNA matches and historical records. They ended up with a family tree that included about 25,000 people. For 18 months, the team searched through records trying to find a match. Then, in June 2024, they finally got lucky. They found a DNA match to a couple who had been born in the 1870s. The team traced forward through that couple's descendants. They found a 2005 obituary for one of the couple's great-great-great-granddaughters. The obituary said she was survived by a daughter named Pepper Reed. When the team searched for records of Pepper Reed, they could not find anything after the 1970s. But when they searched for Pepper Reed's children, they found something within 30 minutes. There was a birth certificate from Orange County, California, for a baby girl born in 1976. Her name was Rhea Rasmussen. The birth certificate listed her parents as Terry Peder Rasmussen and Pepper Reed. The New Hampshire Cold Case Unit found a surviving family member of Pepper Reed and conducted DNA testing. On September 5, 2025, they officially confirmed the identity. The middle child was Rhea Rasmussen, daughter of Terry Rasmussen and Pepper Reed. New Hampshire authorities announced the identification to the public on September 7th and 8th, 2025. Pepper Reed was born in 1952 in Texas. Her family last saw her during Christmas 1975 in Houston, Texas. At the time, she was pregnant with Rasmussen's child. The family believed she later moved to California, though they never saw her or met her baby. Pepper Reed disappeared from public records sometime in the late 1970s. She has never been found. Investigators believe Terry Rasmussen murdered her, just like he murdered Denise Bowden and so many others. On September 8, 2025, at a press conference, New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella said, "This case has weighed on New Hampshire and the nation for decades. With Rhea Rasmussen's identification, all 4 victims now have their names back." After 40 years, all 4 people found in those barrels finally have their names. Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, 24 years old. Marie Elizabeth Vaughan, 6 years old, Sarah Lynn McWaters, 1 year old, and Rhea Rasmussen, between 2 and 4 years old. 4 people who deserve to be remembered, to be mourned by their families, to have their names on their graves. The Bear Brook murders became one of the first major cases to be solved using genetic genealogy. This new method combines traditional DNA analysis with family tree research. It has since been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across the country. Barbara Ray Venter, who helped crack this case, went on to help identify the Golden State Killer and many other criminals and victims. The DNA Doe Project has identified dozens of unknown victims. The techniques used to solve the Bear Brook case have changed how investigators approach cold cases forever. But even with all 4 victims identified, the case is not completely closed. Terry Rasmussen died in prison in 2010, so he will never face trial for the Bear Brook murders. Investigators are still looking for information about Pepper Reed and Denise Bodin, 2 women who disappeared and have never been found. They are still trying to figure out everywhere Rasmussen went between 1974 and 1985, especially in New Hampshire, California, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, and Virginia. Police believe Rasmussen may have killed other people whose bodies have never been found or whose identities are still unknown. The investigation into the full scope of his crimes continues. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 2. Case number 2. On the night of February 3rd, 1972, a blizzard hit Boone, North Carolina. Snow piled up on the roads, ice covered everything. Most people stayed inside their homes where it was warm and safe. But for the Durham family, this winter storm would be the backdrop for one of the most brutal crimes in North Carolina history. 3 members of the same family would be murdered in their own home. For 50 years, nobody knew who killed them or why. The case became known simply as the Durham case, and it haunted investigators, family members, and the entire community for half a century. Bryce Durham was 51 years old in 1972. He was originally from Wilkes County, North Carolina. Bryce had served in the United States Navy during World War II. Part of his service included working on damaged ships at Pearl Harbor. After the war, he came back to North Carolina and became a teacher. He met his wife, Virginia Church, while teaching at Mount Pleasant High School. Virginia was also from Wilkes County. She had gone to college in Kentucky at Bowling Green Business College. After they got married, Bryce left teaching and started working in the auto loan business. The Durhams had 2 children. Their daughter Ginny was born in May 1952. Their son, Bobby Joe, who everyone called Bobby, was born in May 1953. The family moved around quite a bit during the years Bryce worked in the car loan business. They lived in different places across North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina. In 1969, Bryce got the chance to buy his own business. He purchased a Buick dealership in Boone called Modern Buick. This was a dream come true for him. The family moved from Mount Airy to Boone in November 1969. The Durhams bought a brick house at 187 Clyde Townsend Road, just off the North Carolina 105 bypass, on the western side of Boone. To get to the house, you had to drive up a steep hill. The family had been living in Boone for a little over 2 years by February 1972. They mostly kept to themselves. Some people in the community thought they were a bit reserved, but nobody thought anything bad about them. The Durham family was not well known in Boone when the murders happened. They had only lived there since November 1969, which meant they had been in town for about 2 years and 3 months. In a small mountain community, where many families had lived for generations, the Durhams were still considered newcomers. They had not established a large network of friends and neighbours. They were friendly enough when people interacted with them, but they were not the type to get heavily involved in community activities beyond what was necessary for running the business. Bryce ran his car dealership, Modern Buick, on the main road through town. Virginia helped out at the business, handling paperwork and customer service. Bobby was a freshman at Appalachian State University, which was right there in Boone. He had been an Eagle Scout, which showed he was responsible and hard-working. He was athletic and strong. Friends who knew Bobby described him as a quiet, good-hearted, straight-up kind of guy. He was supposed to meet a friend at an Appalachian State basketball game on the night of February 3rd, but he never made it to that game. Instead, he agreed to meet his parents at the dealership, so they could all drive home together safely in the storm. By February 3rd, 1972, the Durham's daughter Ginny was 19 years old. She had married a man named Justin Troy Hall, who most people just called Troy. The couple lived in a trailer park about 4 miles away from the Durham family home. That distance, though it was short, would become very important on the night of February 3rd. The snowstorm started around 3 o'clock in the afternoon that Thursday. By evening, the weather was so bad that hardly anyone was out on the roads. Bryce Durham had plans to attend a Rotary Club meeting that night in Boone. Because of the terrible weather, very few members showed up. The meeting ended a little after 8 o'clock in the evening. Bryce left and drove to his car dealership to pick up his wife Virginia, who had been working there that day. Their son Bobby was also at the dealership. He had agreed to meet his parents there so they could all ride home together safely in the snowstorm. The roads were already getting dangerous. Bryce made a decision. Instead of taking their regular car, he borrowed a brand new 4-wheel drive GMC Jimmy that had just arrived at the dealership. This vehicle would handle the snow and ice much better than a regular car. The 3 family members got into the Jimmy and started the difficult drive home through the blizzard. Somehow they made it back to their house on Clyde Townsend Road. That was the last time anyone saw Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby Durham alive. At around 10:30 that night, Troy Hall received a phone call at the trailer where he and Ginny lived. The call came from Virginia Durham. Her voice sounded strange, muffled, like she was trying to talk without being heard clearly. According to what Troy told police later, Virginia said that some men had her husband and son. She mentioned something about 3 black men. Then the phone line went dead. When Troy tried to call back, he got a busy signal. Troy told Ginny about the call. At first, he thought it might be a prank, but Ginny was worried about her family. She wanted to go check on them right away. Troy agreed. He went out to start his car, but the engine would not turn over in the freezing cold. Troy decided to ask a neighbour for help. The neighbour's name was Cecil Small. Small happened to work as a private investigator. Cecil agreed to drive Troy and Ginny to the Durham house through the storm. The roads were terrible. Ice covered everything. It took the 3 of them nearly an hour to make the 4-mile trip. When they finally got close to the Durham house, the driveway was so icy that Cecil could not drive all the way up. Troy and Cecil got out of the car. They told Ginny to wait in the vehicle while they walked up the steep, icy driveway to check on the house. Ginny stayed behind, sitting in the car, not knowing what the 2 men were about to discover. Troy Hall and Cecil Small walked up to the Durham house. Right away they could tell something was very wrong. The back door was unlocked. When they went inside, they saw that the house had been ransacked. Things were thrown around. There was blood splattered on the walls in the den. The phone cord had been ripped out of the wall. The receiver was lying on the floor. The television was turned on, but the sound was hard to hear over another noise. There was a steady swishing sound of running water coming from somewhere in the house. The 2 men followed the sound of the water. It led them to a bathroom. What they found there would stay with them for the rest of their lives. All 3 members of the Durham family were in the bathroom. Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby were positioned on their stomachs at the side of the bathtub. Their heads were inside the tub, submerged in water. The bathtub was overflowing. Water was running continuously from the faucet, flowing over the top and onto the floor. The 3 victims were not moving. They were dead. Troy and Cecil immediately left the house. They did not go back down to where Ginny was waiting in the car. Instead, they went to a nearby neighbour's apartment and called the police. When the Watauga County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found the horrific scene. All 3 Durham family members were dead. The house looked like someone had searched through it, but the motive was confusing. A bank deposit bag with several $100s in cash was found on the floor. If this was a robbery, why would the killers leave hundreds of dollars behind? About a mile away from the Durham house, on Poplar Grove Road, police found the 4-wheel drive GMC Jimmy that the family had used to drive home from the dealership. The vehicle was still running, the lights were on, the windshield wipers were moving back and forth, the doors were closed. Nobody was inside. When officers searched the Jimmy, they found silverware from the Durham house inside a pillowcase, but valuable items had been left behind at the house. Nothing about this case made sense. The medical examiner performed autopsies on all 3 victims. The results showed how brutal the murders had been. Virginia Durham had been strangled to death with some kind of cord or rope. There was no water in her lungs. She had a bloody nose and other signs of being beaten. Bryce Durham had been partially strangled and then drowned. Water was found in his lungs. He had rope burns around his neck and a fractured skull. Bobby Durham had also been partially strangled and drowned. Water was found in his lungs too. He had rope burns on his neck. All 3 victims had marks showing they had been tied up. One detail stood out to investigators. None of the victims had defensive wounds. There were no scratches on their hands, no broken fingernails, no signs that they had fought back against their attackers. Bobby Durham was only 18 years old. He was athletic, an Eagle Scout, young and strong. For him to be overpowered without fighting back seemed almost impossible, unless there were multiple attackers who moved with lightning speed. The medical examiner said it looked like the family had been overpowered extremely quickly. The community of Boone was shocked. Murders like this simply did not happen in their small mountain town. Boone was home to Appalachian State University. It was a quiet, peaceful community nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. People knew each other. Crime rates were low. The most serious problems police usually dealt with were minor thefts or college students getting into trouble on the weekends. A triple murder during a blizzard was completely unheard of. Fear spread through the area like wildfire. If a whole family could be killed in their own home during a snowstorm, nobody felt safe. Parents locked their doors at night. People looked at their neighbours with suspicion. Everyone wanted to know who could have done such a terrible thing. The Watauga County Sheriff at the time was a man named Ward Carroll. He worked the case along with agents from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. They interviewed more than 200 people over the coming weeks and months. In April 1972, about 2 months after the murders, police actually arrested 4 men and charged them with the killings. These arrests came after an informant who was being questioned about a burglary ring claimed he had information about the Durham case. He said he and 3 other men had gone to the Durham house to rob them, and things had gone wrong. But there were problems with this story from the very beginning. First, all 4 arrested men were white, which contradicted the phone call Virginia Durham supposedly made, saying 3 black men were attacking her family. Second, the informant claimed the Durhams had been killed with shotguns, but everyone knew they had been strangled and drowned. The charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. Police believe the informant had made the whole thing up. The case went cold. Investigators kept working on it over the years, but they had no solid leads. In 1974, Rufus Edmiston became the Attorney General of North Carolina. Edmiston was from Boone. He made the Durham case a top priority for the state's newly formed Unsolved Murder Division. He personally met with Bryce Durham's parents, who begged him to find their son's killers. Edmiston believed the murders were a professional hit job. He told people that nobody would go out on such a terrible snowy night to randomly rob a house. This had to be planned. Decades passed. The 1970s turned into the 1980s, then the 1990s, then the 2000s. Investigators retired. New investigators took over the case. Technology improved. Police ran fingerprint searches periodically to try to match prints found in the Durham house, but nothing ever matched. They attended cold case seminars. They re-interviewed witnesses, but the Durham family murders remained unsolved. Virginia and Bryce Durham's daughter Ginny lived her whole adult life not knowing who killed her family or why. Then, in May 2019, everything changed. The Watauga County Sheriff's Office received a phone call from the White County Sheriff's Office in Georgia. The Georgia Sheriff's Office had information that might be very important to the Durham case. The sheriff of Watauga County at this time was Len Hagerman. Hagerman had actually been involved with the Durham case from the very beginning. Back in 1972, he was a member of the Boone Police Department and he had worked on the investigation. In 2006, he was elected sheriff and he continued to make the Durham case a priority. When he got the call from Georgia, he knew this might finally be the break they had been waiting for. The information from Georgia came from a man named Shane Burt. Shane was the son of a convicted murderer named Billy Sunday Burt. Shane had gone to the White County Sheriff's Office in Georgia to do research for a book he was writing. The book was about various crimes in Georgia, including a 1973 case called the Fleming case. While Shane was at the sheriff's office, he mentioned something his father had told him during a prison visit. Billy Sunday Burt had admitted to killing 3 people in the North Carolina mountains during a heavy snowstorm. Billy told his son they had almost gotten caught because of the weather. Shane said he was very close with his father and he remembered this story clearly. When the White County Sheriff's Office heard this information, they immediately contacted the Watauga County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Hagerman and his investigators started looking into the lead. They discovered that Billy Sunday Burt had been part of a loosely organized criminal network known as the Dixie Mafia. This was not a mafia like people see in movies. It was a group of criminals based in Georgia who worked together on various crimes throughout the Southeast during the 1960s and 1970s. They were involved in everything, from running illegal whiskey, to bank robberies, to murder for hire. Billy Sunday Burt had been convicted of murdering an elderly couple in Georgia in December 1973. The victims were Reed Oliver Fleming and Lois Fleming. They were in their 70s. Fleming was a retired car dealer who was known to keep large amounts of cash at his home. On December 22, 1973, Billy Burt, along with two other men, Bobby Jean Gaddis and Charles David Reed, broke into the Fleming home. They tortured the elderly couple, trying to force them to reveal where their money was hidden. They strangled both victims with coat hangers wrapped around their necks. They stole about $4,000 in coins that had been buried in fruit jars in the Fleming smokehouse. All three men were convicted of the Fleming murders. Burt and Gaddis received death sentences, though these were later changed to life in prison. Reed received 4 life sentences. There was a fourth man involved in the Fleming case who served as a getaway driver. His name was Billy Wayne Davis. Davis was also convicted in connection with the Fleming murders, but Davis had committed other murders too. In 1971, Davis had killed someone else and was serving a life sentence for that murder at the Augusta State Medical Prison in Georgia. Sheriff Hageman learned that 3 of the 4 men from the Fleming case were now dead. Billy Sunday Burt had died in prison in 2017. Bobby Jean Gaddis had died in prison. Charles David Reed had died in prison. But Billy Wayne Davis was still alive. He was 81 years old in 2019, and he was still locked up in Georgia, serving his life sentence. Hageman decided to go interview Davis in person. Between September 2019 and August 2021, Watauga County Sheriff's Office investigators conducted 3 separate in-person interviews with Billy Wayne Davis at the Georgia prison where he was incarcerated. The first interview happened in September 2019. Investigators traveled to the Augusta State Medical Prison in Georgia where Davis was being held. Davis was 81 years old at this point. He had been in prison for decades, serving a life sentence for a murder he committed in 1971. He had nothing to gain by confessing to the Durham murders. He was already going to die in prison, but during these interviews, Davis admitted he had been involved in the Durham family murders. Davis told investigators that he and 3 other men, Billy Sunday Burt, Bobby Jean Gaddis, and Charles David Reed, had gone to the Durham house on the night of February 3, 1972. The investigators returned for a second interview in October 2020. By this time, they had gathered more evidence and had more specific questions to ask Davis. They wanted to make sure his story was consistent and that it matched the physical evidence from the crime scene. The third and final interview took place in August 2021. Each interview provided more details and helped investigators corroborate the information Davis was giving them. According to Davis, the 4 men were carrying out a hired hit. Someone had paid them to kill the Durham family. This was not a random robbery gone wrong. This was a planned murder. Davis claimed he was just the getaway driver. He said he stayed outside the Durham house while Burt, Gaddis and Reed went inside and killed the family. Davis said the 3 men entered through the back door. They overpowered the family quickly. They tied them up. They strangled them. They held their heads underwater in the bathtub until they drowned. Then they ransacked the house to make it look like a robbery. They took some silverware and put it in the GMC Jimmy. They drove the vehicle about a mile away and left it running to create confusion about what had happened. Davis said they had almost gotten caught trying to leave Boone because the snowstorm was so bad. The roads were covered in ice and snow. Their getaway vehicle had trouble on the steep, winding mountain roads. They were afraid the police would catch them before they could get out of town. But somehow, they managed to escape and make it back to Georgia. Davis would not say who hired them to kill the Durhams. He claimed he did not know. The person who arranged the hit, Davis said, had worked through Billy Sunday Burt. Since Burt was dead, that secret died with him. Investigators also interviewed 2 other sources who provided information that matched evidence from the Durham crime scene. The similarities between the Durham murders and the Fleming murders were striking. Both were brutal killings. Both involved the same group of men. Both appeared to be planned rather than random. In November 2021, Sheriff Hageman and his team met with members of the Durham family. They told them about their investigation and their conclusions. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the family finally had answers about who killed Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby. On February 8, 2022, exactly 50 years after the murders, the Watauga County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. They publicly announced that they had solved the Durham case. Sheriff Hageman told the press that 4 men were responsible for the deaths of the Durham family. Billy Wayne Davis, age 81, was the only one still alive, serving a life sentence in Georgia for another murder. The other 3 perpetrators, Billy Sunday Burt, Bobby Jean Gaddis, and Charles David Reed, were all dead. All 4 men had been part of the Georgia-based Dixie Mafia. Led by Burt, the group had committed dozens of violent crimes across the Southeast during the 1960s and 1970s. The Durham murders had been a hired hit, though who hired them remained unclear. No charges would be filed in the Durham case. 3 of the 4 killers were dead. The 4th, Billy Wayne Davis, was already serving a life sentence and would die in prison. There was no point in prosecuting him. The goal of the investigation had been to bring closure to the family and the community, and they had accomplished that goal. At the press conference, Ginny Durham released a statement. She thanked all the people who had worked on her family's case for decades. She knew that investigators had sacrificed many days and weekends trying to solve the case since 1972. She especially thanked Sheriff Len Hageman, who had been involved with the case from the very beginning and had dedicated himself to finding closure for her family. She thanked SBI Special Agent Wade Colvard, Captain Carolyn Johnson of the Watauga County Sheriff's Office, and Charles Whitman, an SBI special agent who had worked on the case and continued to work on it even after he retired. She said she was grateful for their help and friendship during the difficult years. Sheriff Hageman also spoke at the press conference. He thanked the many agencies that had worked on the case over the years. These included the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the Boone Police Department, the White County Sheriff's Office in Georgia, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the Appalachian State University Police Department. He said the case had touched the high country community and beyond, and they were grateful for everyone who had played a role in helping to find answers for the Durham family. Chris Laws, the special agent in charge for the Northwestern District of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, also spoke. He said that if Sheriff Hageman and his team had not taken the tip from the White County Sheriff's Office seriously, the case might never have been solved. Many law enforcement officials, investigators and agents had worked diligently on the case for decades. Some had worked on it until their deaths. Some had continued working on it even after retirement. The announcement brought a measure of peace to the community. For 50 years, people in Boone had wondered who killed the Durham family and why. Now they knew. But some questions would never be answered. Who hired Billy Sunday Burt and his crew to murder the Durhams? Why did the family have to be killed on that specific night during a terrible snowstorm? What had the Durhams done, or what did they know, that made someone want them dead? Sheriff Hageman addressed these questions at the press conference. He said that many people in law enforcement had speculated about who arranged the murders and why. Unfortunately, whoever arranged the murders was forever lost due to the death of Billy Sunday Burt in 2017. Some people had even speculated that Troy Hall, the son-in-law who found the bodies, might have been involved in arranging the hit. Hageman said he would have loved to interview Troy Hall about these suspicions, but Hall had died on December 19, 2019. The sheriff no longer had that option. What Hageman did have was a confession from the last living person who was at the Durham house the night the murders were committed. Billy Wayne Davis had admitted his role in the crime. He had placed himself and 3 other men at the scene. His story matched the physical evidence. His description of the crime matched what happened to the Fleming couple in Georgia a year later. The case was as solved as it could be under the circumstances. Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby Durham are buried in the Pleasant Home Baptist Church Cemetery on Bird Road in Roaring River, North Carolina. For 50 years, their graves stood as a reminder of an unsolved mystery. Now those graves represent something else. They represent the perseverance of investigators who never gave up. They represent the dedication of family members who never stopped asking for justice. They represent the power of new information and the importance of following up on leads, even decades after a crime occurred. The Durham case also represents something darker. It shows how organised crime operated in the Southeast during the 1960s and 1970s. The Dixie Mafia was not a structured organisation like the traditional Italian mafia. It was a loose network of criminals who knew each other and worked together when it suited them. They ran illegal whiskey, they robbed banks, they committed murders for hire. Billy Sunday Burt was at the centre of this network. One of his sons told investigators that Burt had killed over 100 people during his criminal career. The Durham family was just 3 of those victims. The case also shows how a single piece of information can break open a cold case after decades. Shane Burt's decision to mention his father's confession while researching a book led directly to solving the murders. If Shane had not gone to the White County Sheriff's Office that day in 2019, if he had not mentioned what his father told him, the Durham case might still be unsolved today. The White County Sheriff's Office could have ignored the information or thought it was not important, but they took it seriously and contacted Watauga County. Sheriff Hageman could have dismissed the tip as just another dead end, but instead he travelled to Georgia and personally interviewed Billy Wayne Davis 3 times over 2 years. For Ginny Durham Hall, the resolution brought both relief and continued pain. She finally knew who killed her mother, father, and brother, but she would never know why. She would never know what her family did to make someone angry enough to hire killers. She would never understand why it had to happen on a snowy night when she was just 19 years old, starting her adult life. The murders took away half of her family in a single night and left her with questions that would haunt her for the next 50 years. The Durham case became one of the most famous unsolved murders in North Carolina history. People wrote books about it. Podcasts covered it. News articles revisited it every few years on anniversaries of the crime. In 2024, a local historian named Terry Harmon published a detailed book called Convoluted: The 1972 Durham Family Triple Homicide. Harmon had lived just 2 miles from the Durham house when the murders occurred. He was 6 years old at the time. The case had fascinated him his entire life. His book examines every aspect of the case, every theory, every lead, every suspect. It represents hundreds of hours of research and interviews. Even with the case officially solved, some people still have doubts. Some believe there is more to the story than what Billy Wayne Davis told investigators. Some think the motive for the murders is still hidden. Some wonder if Davis was telling the truth when he said he was just the getaway driver, or if he went into the house with the others. Some question whether all 4 men were really at the Durham house that night, or if Davis was protecting someone else. These doubts and questions will probably never be fully resolved. The 4 men who were at the Durham house on February 3rd, 1972, are all either dead or will die in prison. The person who hired them is unknown and likely dead as well. The physical evidence from 1972 is old and limited by the technology available at that time. There are no DNA tests that can be run, no security cameras existed to review, no cell phone records to track. The case was solved the old-fashioned way, through interviews, confessions, and connecting the dots between similar crimes. What is certain is that the Durham family deserved better. Bryce Durham was a Navy veteran who served his country during World War II. He worked hard his entire life. He achieved his dream of owning his own business. Virginia Durham was a dedicated wife and mother who worked alongside her husband at the car dealership. Bobby Durham was just 18 years old. He was a college student with his whole life ahead of him. He was a good kid, an Eagle Scout, someone who followed the rules and did the right thing. None of them deserved to be murdered in their own home. None of them deserved to have their deaths go unsolved for 50 years. The Durham case is now closed. The killers have been identified. The family has answers. The community has closure. But the scars remain. The fear that gripped Boone in February 1972 has faded, but it has not disappeared completely. The case is a reminder that evil exists in the world. It is a reminder that sometimes bad things happen to good people for reasons that make no sense. It is also a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. It took 50 years, but the truth finally came to light. Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby Durham can rest in peace, knowing that the world knows who killed them, even if the world will never fully understand why. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 3. Case number 3. On the summer day of June 7th, 1969, the pews of Pilgrim Congregational Church in Billings, Montana, were filled with happy family members and friends. One side held the family of Clifford Bernhardt, the other side held the family of Linda Reich. The childhood sweethearts were getting married. It was a joyous occasion for everyone who knew them. Clifford and Linda had grown up in Billings. They had known each other since they were young. Now they were starting their lives together as husband and wife. Nobody at that wedding could have imagined that just 4 years later, both of them would be dead, murdered in their own home in one of the most brutal crimes Billings had ever seen. Clifford Bernhardt was a Vietnam veteran. He had served his country during the Vietnam War and was awarded a Purple Heart for his service. The Purple Heart is a military medal given to soldiers who are wounded or killed while serving. Clifford had seen combat in Vietnam and Cambodia. After being discharged from the military in 1971, he came back home to Montana. He got a job working at Quality Concrete, doing hard physical labour. Clifford was a good, hard-working man who wanted to build a life for himself and his wife. Linda Bernhardt, whose maiden name was Reich, was an aspiring teacher. She had dreams of working in education. While she worked toward that goal, she took a job at Ryan Wholesale Grocers, a grocery distribution warehouse in Billings. She worked in the billing and secretarial department, handling paperwork and office tasks. Linda and Clifford worked hard. They both wanted to save money and build their future together. Linda even took on a second job in the evenings. She would join Clifford to clean carpets at night after her day job ended. They wanted children. They wanted to have enough money to give those children a good life. They were young, in love, and working toward their dreams. By the fall of 1973, Clifford and Linda had saved enough money to build their own home. After years of saving and planning, they finally moved into a brand new house at 1116 Dorothy Lane in the Billings Heights area. The street had a charming name, and the house was exactly what they had worked so hard for. They moved in during October 1973. Everything seemed perfect. They had only been in their new home for about a month when their lives were violently stolen from them. November 6, 1973 was a Tuesday. It was a cold, snowy night in Billings. Clifford and Linda came home from work that evening like they always did. At some point that night, someone entered their home. What happened next would shock the community and baffle investigators for the next 45 years. On November 7, 1973, Linda did not show up for work. This was very unusual. Linda was a responsible person. She always showed up on time. Her co-workers at Ryan Wholesale Grocers became concerned. They contacted Linda's mother and told her that Linda had not come to work. Linda's mother immediately knew something was wrong. She drove to the house on Dorothy Lane. When she got there, she forced her way inside. What Linda's mother found was a scene of horror. She discovered Clifford's body first. He was face down in a pool of blood in the master bedroom. Then she found Linda's body in another bedroom. Linda was also face down. Both of them were clearly dead. Linda's mother called the police immediately. When law enforcement arrived, they began to piece together what had happened. The autopsies revealed the terrible details of how Clifford and Linda died. Both victims had been strangled. Clifford had suffered a severe wound to his head, but the cause of death was strangulation. Linda had also been strangled to death. There was evidence that both of them had been bound at their wrists and ankles at some point during the attack. Investigators could not find what had been used to tie them up. Whatever the killer used to bind them, he took it with him when he left. Linda had been sexually assaulted. This detail suggested that she might have been the main target of the attack, though investigators could not be certain. The crime scene showed other disturbing details. The killer had taken specific items from the house. A large green suitcase was missing. All of Linda's underwear was gone. Some pairs of her shoes were also missing. These items suggested the killer had a personal interest in Linda specifically, but other valuable items in the house were left behind. If this was a robbery, the killer had not taken things that would normally be stolen. There were place settings for 3 people in the home, as if the couple had been expecting someone for dinner. This suggested that Clifford and Linda knew their killer. The windows in the house had been opened, even though it was a cold, snowy night. Investigators believed the killer opened the windows to make the house cold, which would confuse the time of death estimates. This showed planning and knowledge of how investigations work. The house was very cold when Linda's mother arrived. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no signs of a break-in. Everything pointed to the possibility that Clifford and Linda had let their killer into their home willingly. They knew this person. They trusted this person enough to have them over for a meal. The double murder shocked Billings. The community was devastated. News coverage described it as the most sensational unsolved murder case in Billings history. Clifford and Linda were just 24 years old. They had their whole lives ahead of them. They had worked hard, saved money, built their dream home, and were planning for their future. Now they were both dead, murdered in the house they had been living in for less than a month. The Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office and other law enforcement agencies launched a massive investigation. They interviewed hundreds of people. Anyone who knew the couple was questioned. All of their co-workers were interviewed. Their friends and family members were interviewed. The investigators looked at everyone in the couple's social circles. They tried to figure out who could have done this terrible thing. Authorities even brought in psychologists to try to build a profile of the killer. They used every tool available to them in 1973. They followed every lead. They checked every possible suspect. At one point, they even brought in a psychic, desperate for any clue that might help them solve the case. But despite all their efforts, the investigation went nowhere. The case went cold. Years passed. The 1970s turned into the 1980s. The investigators who had worked on the case retired. New investigators took over the files. The case file grew bigger and bigger as more information was collected, but there were no breakthroughs. Families of Clifford and Linda were left with no answers. Many of them eventually left Billings, unable to stay in the place where such a horrible thing had happened to their loved ones. Linda's sister, Kelly Reich, talked about the impact the murders had on her family in 2014. She said it changed their whole lives. She explained that until something like that happens to you, you cannot really understand how devastating it is. The family was torn apart. They lost Linda and Clifford. Then they lost the sense of safety and peace they had once felt in their hometown. The case haunted everyone who knew the couple. In 2004, something changed. Investigators discovered DNA evidence on items that had been collected from the crime scene back in 1973. Specifically, DNA was found on the purple pants that Linda Bernhardt had been wearing the night she was killed. The sheriff's office announced in 2005 that the killer's DNA had been successfully extracted from this evidence. DNA technology had improved dramatically since 1973. In 1973, DNA analysis as we know it today did not exist. The structure of DNA had been discovered in 1953, but the technology to use DNA for identification purposes was not developed until the 1980s. The first use of DNA in a criminal case happened in 1986 in England. By the 1990s, DNA testing was becoming more common in the United States. By 2004, it was a standard tool in criminal investigations. The DNA from the crime scene was analysed and entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS. This is a database that contains DNA profiles from known criminals across the country. The database includes DNA from people who have been arrested or convicted of certain crimes. The idea is that if someone commits multiple crimes, their DNA can link them to different crime scenes. The investigators hoped they would get a match. They hoped the killer's DNA was already in the system because he had committed other crimes and been arrested. When the Bernhardt DNA was run through CODIS, the computer would search millions of profiles looking for a match. If the killer had been arrested for anything that required DNA collection, his profile would be in the database and the computer would find it. But when they searched the database, there was no match. The killer's DNA was not in CODIS. This was deeply frustrating for the investigators. They finally had DNA evidence, which was supposed to be the key to solving crimes, but it led nowhere. The killer's DNA was not in the system. This meant the killer either had no criminal record or had never been caught for any crimes that required DNA to be collected. It was another dead end. However, the DNA evidence was not useless. The investigators could now test DNA samples from potential suspects and compare them to the crime scene DNA. Over the years following the 2004 discovery, about 80 people who had been considered possible suspects were asked to provide DNA samples. Each time the DNA was tested and compared to the crime scene evidence. Each time the result was the same: no match. Person after person was eliminated as a suspect. In 2012, the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office put together a cold case unit. This was a team of investigators, some retired and working as volunteers, who would focus specifically on old, unsolved cases. The Bernhardt case was one of their top priorities. One of these investigators, Scott Goodwin, later said they were obsessed with the case. He said Clifford and Linda were two young people who did not deserve what happened to them. They had done nothing wrong. They came home on a Tuesday night and were murdered. The cold case unit was determined to find answers. In 2013, an anonymous donor offered a reward of $100,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer. This was a huge amount of money. The donor clearly believed that a financial reward might encourage someone with information to come forward. But even with that much money on the table, nobody came forward with the information needed to solve the case. Then in 2015, the Cold Case Unit took a new approach. They contacted a company called Parabon Nanolabs. This company is based in Reston, Virginia, and specializes in DNA technology. Parabon had developed new services that went beyond traditional DNA analysis. One service was called Snapshot DNA Analysis. This service could predict what a person looked like based on their DNA. Using just a DNA sample, Parabon could predict the person's skin color, hair color, eye color, complexion, and ethnicity. The Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office sent the DNA evidence from the Bernhardt crime scene to Parabon. The company analyzed it and created a composite sketch showing what they believed the killer looked like. They predicted his physical characteristics based on his genetic code. This composite would later prove to be remarkably accurate. The technology Parabon used is called DNA phenotyping. Phenotyping means predicting physical traits from genetic information. Scientists have learned that certain genes control certain physical features. Genes determine eye color, hair color, skin color, and other visible traits. By analyzing someone's DNA, scientists can make educated predictions about what that person looks like. The composite sketch that Parabon created from the Bernhardt crime scene DNA showed a man with specific features. When investigators later compared this composite to an actual yearbook photo of Cecil Caldwell, the resemblance was striking. The DNA phenotyping had accurately predicted what Caldwell looked like, based only on his genetic code. This showed how powerful this technology had become. For the investigators in Montana, seeing the composite sketch was encouraging. It gave them hope that they were on the right track. But a sketch alone could not solve the case. They needed a name. They needed to identify the actual person. That is where genetic genealogy came in. Parabon offered another service that was even more revolutionary. They could take DNA from a crime scene and compare it to public genealogy databases. Millions of people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to companies like Ancestry and 23andMe to learn about their heritage and find distant relatives. Some of these people had uploaded their DNA data to a public database called GEDmatch. GEDmatch allowed people to compare their DNA with others and find family connections. The technique of using these public databases to solve crimes is called genetic genealogy. The way it works is simple in concept, but complex in practice. Investigators take the unknown killer's DNA from the crime scene. They upload it to GEDmatch. The database finds people who share portions of that DNA. These people are distant relatives of the killer. They might be third cousins, or fourth cousins, or even more distant. Then genetic genealogists build family trees going backward in time, figuring out who the common ancestors were. Finally, they work forward through the generations to figure out who could be the killer, based on age, location, and other factors. This technique became famous in April 2018, when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer in California. That case showed the world that genetic genealogy could solve crimes that had been cold for decades. By the time the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office contacted Parabon in 2015, genetic genealogy was becoming more and more refined as a tool for law enforcement. C.C. Moore was the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. She and her team went to work on the Bernhardt case. They submitted the crime scene DNA to GEDmatch. The database had about 1.2 million DNA profiles at the time. They searched for anyone who shared DNA with the unknown killer. Then they started building family trees, going back generation after generation. The work was painstaking. C.C. Moore and her team traced the killer's family tree back to the year 1832. They went back nearly 150 years in history, finding ancestors and documenting family connections. They looked at birth records, marriage records, death records, newspaper articles, and any other historical documents they could find. Slowly, they built a massive family tree, showing how different branches of the family were connected. The process of genetic genealogy requires patience and careful attention to detail. When DNA from the crime scene is uploaded to GEDmatch, it gets compared to all the other DNA profiles in the database. The system identifies people who share segments of DNA with the unknown person. These shared segments indicate a family relationship. The closer the relationship, the more DNA is shared. Parents and children share about 50% of their DNA. Siblings also share about 50%. First cousins share about 12.5%. Second cousins share about 3.1%. Third cousins share about 0.78%. The relationships get more distant and the shared DNA gets smaller as you go further out on the family tree. In the Bernhardt case, the people who matched the killer's DNA in GEDmatch were distant relatives. They were not close family members. This meant CeCe Moore and her team had to go back many generations to find the common ancestors. Then they had to work forward through time, tracking every descendant of those ancestors, trying to figure out which branch of the family tree led to the killer. This work involved looking at census records to see where people lived at different times. It involved looking at city directories to see where people worked. It involved looking at marriage records to track name changes and new family connections. It involved looking at obituaries to see who survived whom and how families were structured. Every piece of information helped build a more complete picture of the family tree. As the family tree grew, it eventually included thousands of people. CeCe Moore had to eliminate people based on age, gender, and location. The killer had to be male based on the DNA evidence. The killer had to be old enough in 1973 to commit the murders. The killer had to have a connection to Billings, Montana. Each of these factors helped narrow down the list of possible suspects. The genetic genealogy work took years. Parabon had been working with the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office since 2015. It was not until early 2019, nearly 4 years later, that they finally narrowed the suspects down to 2 brothers. The amount of time and effort that went into this work was extraordinary, but CeCe Moore and her team were committed to finding answers for the Bernhardt family. On January 3, 2019, Parabon reached a major breakthrough. They had narrowed down the possible suspects to just 2 closely related individuals. These 2 men were brothers. One of them was already dead. The other was still alive, living outside of Montana. Parabon called this a high-confidence lead. They believed one of these 2 brothers was almost certainly the Bernhardt killer. On January 8, 2019, investigators from the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office contacted the living brother. They explained the situation and asked him to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. The brother agreed. He gave investigators a DNA sample that could be tested and compared to the crime scene evidence. The DNA sample was sent to Sorensen Forensics, a private laboratory based in Utah. On January 21, 2019, Sorensen Forensics reported their findings. The DNA profile from the living brother was consistent with the profile from the 1973 crime scene. This meant that either the living brother or his deceased brother could be the killer. Both men shared enough DNA with the crime scene evidence that either one could be responsible. The Montana State Crime Lab then did further DNA analysis. They carefully compared the living brother's DNA to the crime scene DNA. Through detailed testing, they were able to eliminate the living brother as the source of the crime scene DNA. He was not the killer. That left only one possibility. The deceased brother must be the killer. The deceased brother was Cecil Stan Caldwell. Cecil had moved to Billings in 1964. He had worked for most of his life as an employee of the City of Billings Sanitation Department. In 1973, at the time of the murders, Cecil Caldwell was working at Ryan Wholesale Grocers, the same place where Linda Bernhardt worked. Linda worked in billing and secretarial work. Cecil worked in the warehouse and meat department. The 2 had contact on a regular basis. They knew each other. They worked together. When investigators went back through the old case files from 1973, they found that Cecil Caldwell's name was in the file. He had been one of the people who worked with Linda, but no one could recall anything specific about him. He had probably never been formally interviewed as a suspect. He was just another name in a long list of people who knew the victims. He had not stood out in any way during the original investigation. Cecil Caldwell had a completely spotless record. He had no criminal history whatsoever. He had never been arrested. He had never been in trouble with the law. This explained why his DNA was not in CODIS. Only people who are convicted of certain crimes have their DNA collected and entered into law enforcement databases. Cecil Caldwell had never been convicted of anything, so his DNA was not in the system. Cecil Caldwell had lived what appeared to be a normal life after the murders. He continued working for the City of Billings. He was married and had adopted 2 children at the time of the murders. He later divorced and remarried a woman who had children from a previous relationship. He lived in Billings his entire adult life. Nobody suspected him of anything. He seemed like an ordinary person. He died in 2003 at the age of 59. His obituary appeared in the Billings Gazette. It made no mention of any crimes. He had died believing he had gotten away with murder. On March 25, 2019, the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. Sheriff Mike Linder announced that after 45 years, the Bernhardt case had been solved. The murderer was Cecil Stan Caldwell. Members of the Bernhardt and Reich families attended the press conference. They had only learned about the identification that morning. They sat together, holding hands, occasionally wiping away tears. They had waited 45 years for this moment. The families released a statement thanking the sheriff's office and everyone who had worked on the case. They said they were relieved to finally have closure. They asked for privacy as they processed the news. Sheriff Linder read their statement at the press conference. At the press conference, investigators displayed hundreds of case files stacked on a long table. The files represented 45 years of investigation. There were 36,000 pages of documents. There were records of 894 contacts made with individuals, in interviews and gathering information. The sheer volume of paperwork showed how much work had gone into trying to solve this case over the decades. Sheriff Linder thanked everyone who had worked on the case over the years. He thanked the Cold Case Unit volunteers, many of whom were retired law enforcement officers. He thanked the Montana State Crime Lab. He thanked Montana Attorney General Tim Fox, whose office had focused efforts on cold cases in Montana. He thanked all the agencies that had helped over the years. CeCe Moore from Parabon Nanolabs joined the press conference via video link from Virginia. She said her team at Parabon had been deeply touched by the Bernhardt case. She said they were happy to finally bring answers and closure to families across the country using genetic genealogy. She said their hearts went out to Clifford and Linda's families. Vince Wallace, a former detective captain with the sheriff's office, who was working for the Billings Police Department by 2019, spoke at the press conference. He said genetic genealogy would become the gold standard for solving cold cases across the country. He noted that Montana had over 200 unsolved cases, and genetic genealogy was the key that could unlock the doors on many of those cases. Sheriff Linder addressed the question of motive. Why did Cecil Caldwell kill Clifford and Linda Bernhardt? The sheriff said there were a lot of theories about why and how the murders happened, but they would probably never know for certain. Linda Bernhardt was likely the target based on the evidence. The sexual assault, the taking of her personal items, the fact that Cecil knew her from work, all suggested he had some kind of obsession with, but what exactly drove him to commit murder would remain a mystery. Cecil Caldwell took that information to his grave in 2003. Investigators noted that there was other circumstantial evidence and unspecified behaviour by Caldwell that connected him to the crime, but they declined to give additional details. They wanted to respect the privacy of the families and did not want to share every gruesome detail publicly. Dean Marlin was one of the original investigators on the case back in 1973. Even after he retired, he would find himself from time to time staring through the windshield of his car, thinking about the Bernhardt murders. The case had haunted him for decades. When he heard the news that the case was solved, it brought a sense of relief. The obsession that law enforcement officers had felt about this case for 45 years finally had a resolution. Norm Sills was another one of the original investigators from 1973. He attended the press conference in 2019 as part of the Cold Case Unit. Standing with his fellow investigators, many of them volunteers, he represented the dedication and perseverance that had kept this case alive for so many years. These men and women had refused to give up, even when the case seemed hopeless. The Bernhardt case became one of the first major cold cases in Montana to be solved using genetic genealogy. It showed what was possible with this new technology. Since the identification of the Golden State Killer in April 2018, genetic genealogy had helped identify suspects in more than 40 violent crimes across the country. The Bernhardt case added to that growing list. Sheriff Linder later appeared on the Dr. Oz show to talk about the case. The episode was titled True Crime, Dinner Date with a Murderer? The Cold Case of Young Newlyweds Cracked. Sheriff Linder spoke to Dr. Mehmet Oz through a video conference about the case and about how genetic genealogy was being used to solve cold cases. The sheriff said it was nerve-wracking to be on such a big television show, but he wanted to share the story of how the case was solved. The Bernhardt case highlighted both the power and the limitations of genetic genealogy. The power was clear. A case that had been completely cold for decades was solved using DNA and family trees. Investigators were able to identify a killer who had no criminal record and who had died 16 years before being identified. Without genetic genealogy, the case would likely never have been solved. But the limitations were also apparent. There would be no trial, there would be no conviction, There would be no punishment for Cecil Caldwell. He had lived a full life and died of natural causes at age 59, never facing justice for what he did to Clifford and Linda Bernhardt. The families got answers, but they did not get to see the killer punished. The $100,000 reward offered by the anonymous donor would never be claimed because there was no arrest and conviction. The case also raised questions about motive that would never be answered. Investigators could theorize that Cecil Caldwell had an obsession with Linda. They could speculate about what drove him to murder, but without being able to question him, without being able to hear his confession or explanation, the full truth would never be known. All they had were the physical facts, the DNA evidence, the crime scene details, the connection between Cecil and Linda through their work. The Bernhardt murders destroyed 2 families and shook an entire community. Linda's family was devastated. Clifford's family was devastated. Their friends and loved ones were traumatized. The sense of safety that people felt in Billings was shattered. For 45 years, people wondered who had killed the young couple. Was the killer still in Billings? Had he killed again? Was he someone they knew? These questions haunted the community. The resolution in 2019 brought both relief and sadness. Relief that the killer had been identified. Relief that he was dead and could never hurt anyone else. Relief that the families finally had answers. But also sadness that it took so long. Sadness that Cecil Caldwell never faced justice. Sadness that Clifford and Linda never got to live the lives they had planned. Clifford and Linda Bernhardt had worked so hard to build their future. They had saved money for years. They had built their dream home. They had plans for children and a family. They were good people who treated others well. Investigators said they never found anyone who had a bad word to say about the Bernhardt. Everyone who knew them described them as kind, hard-working, and decent. The summer wedding in 1969 had been filled with hope and joy. 4 years later, that same church held their funerals. The pews were filled again, but this time with grief instead of celebration. The families who had come together to celebrate a marriage came together again to mourn a double murder. The Bernhardt case serves as a reminder of several important truths. First, cold cases are never truly closed until they are solved. The investigators who worked on this case never gave up. They kept looking for answers even when it seemed hopeless. Second, technology can change everything. DNA analysis that was impossible in 1973 became routine by 2004. Genetic genealogy that seemed like science fiction became reality by 2018. Third, justice can be delayed, but still meaningful. Even though Cecil Caldwell never stood trial, identifying him as the killer gave the families answers they desperately needed. The case also shows the importance of public DNA databases. The people who uploaded their DNA to GED Match had no idea they would help solve a murder. They were just trying to learn about their family history and find distant relatives. But their willingness to share their genetic information made it possible to identify Cecil Caldwell. Without those public databases, genetic genealogy would not work. Some people worry about privacy issues related to genetic genealogy. They wonder if it is right for police to use public databases to solve crimes. They worry about potential misuse of genetic information. These are legitimate concerns that society will need to address as this technology becomes more common. But for the Bernhardt family, genetic genealogy brought an end to 45 years of uncertainty and pain. Clifford and Linda Bernhardt were married for only 4 years before their lives were taken. They were both just 24 years old when they died. They had barely started their adult lives. They never got to have the children they wanted. They never got to grow old together. They never got to see what their lives could have become. But they are not forgotten. The dedication of law enforcement officers, forensic scientists, genetic genealogists, and many others ensured that their case was solved. The people who worked on this case, some for decades, made sure that Clifford and Linda's story did not end with their murders. It ended with answers, with identification of their killer, and with a demonstration that even after 45 years, the truth can still come to light. The files containing 36,000 pages of investigation can now be closed. The case that was once described as the most sensational unsolved murder in Billings history is solved. Clifford and Linda Bernhardt finally have justice, even if that justice came too late to see their killer punished. Their families can remember them not just as victims of an unsolved mystery, but as victims who were not forgotten, whose case was finally solved, and whose killer was finally named. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 4. Case number 4. J. Roland Cook was born on December 16, 1966. Tanya Van Cuylenberg was born on March 7, 1969. Both of them grew up in Saanich, a district on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. Saanich is part of the Greater Victoria area, a beautiful region known for its mild weather and scenic coastline. Jay and Tanya met in high school. They became friends first, and then their friendship grew into something more. By the fall of 1987, they had been dating for about 6 months. Jay was 20 years old in November 1987. He was tall with soft brown eyes and brown hair that he wore in a style popular at the time. His friends and family were the most important things in his life. Jay spent most of his free time with the people he cared about. He had hopes and dreams for his future. He wanted to go to school to study marine biology. He loved the ocean and wanted to work with sea life. Jay had a goofy side to his personality that his family remembers fondly. He had odd habits that made people laugh, like his strange tendency to lose his clothes. His little sister Laura adored him. They had the kind of sibling relationship where they could joke around and have fun together. Tanya was 18 years old in November 1987. She had just graduated from high school in June of that year. She had round cheeks and an easy smile that made people feel comfortable around her. Tanya was quiet, but she had a good sense of humour. At her high school graduation, she wore a tuxedo with a green bow tie, which showed she had her own sense of style and did not always follow what everyone else was doing. Tanya dreamed of becoming a photographer. She loved taking pictures and capturing moments on film. She had a Minolta X 735mm camera that she treasured. This camera would become an important piece of evidence in the investigation into her death. Jay lived with his parents, Gordon and Leona Cook, and his sisters Laura and Kelly. Gordon ran a furnace business. He worked with a partner named Spud, whose last name was Talbot, with 1 T. The furnace business required ordering parts and supplies regularly. In mid-November 1987, Gordon needed to pick up about $750 worth of furnace parts from a company called Gensco in South Seattle, Washington. The company was located in the Sodo district, an industrial area south of downtown Seattle. Gordon asked Jay if he would make the trip down to Seattle to pick up the parts. The drive from Victoria to Seattle required taking ferries across the water and then driving on highways in Washington state. It would be an overnight trip. Gordon gave Jay cash for a hotel room, but Jay planned to save money by sleeping in the van outside the business instead of paying for a hotel. Jay invited Tanya to come along on the trip. This would be their first trip together as a couple. They saw it as a romantic adventure, a chance to spend time together away from home, a chance to have fun and enjoy each other's company. On the morning of November 18, 1987, Jay prepared for the trip. He packed sleeping mats and blankets into his father's van. The van was a bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon. It was a big, boxy vehicle perfect for hauling furnace parts. Jay also had a leftover sandwich that he split with his little sister Laura before he left. As Jay drove away from the house to go pick up Tanya, Laura stood at the window and waved goodbye to her brother. She watched him drive out of sight. She had no way of knowing this would be the last time she would ever see Jay alive. Jay picked up Tanya and they drove to the ferry terminal in Victoria. They boarded the MV Coho ferry bound for Port Angeles, Washington. The Coho is a car ferry that crosses the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the body of water that separates Vancouver Island from the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. The ferry left Victoria at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The crossing takes about 90 minutes. Jay and Tanya arrived in Port Angeles around 5:30 in the evening, just after sunset. From Port Angeles, Jay and Tanya needed to drive to Bremerton to catch another ferry to Seattle. The most direct route would have been to take Highway 101 east to the Hood Canal Bridge, cross the bridge, and then continue on to Bremerton. However, somewhere along the way, Jay and Tanya missed the turn for the Hood Canal Bridge. They ended up driving much farther than they needed to. At approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, Jay and Tanya stopped at the Hood Canal grocery store in Hoodsport, Washington. This store was about an hour south of where they should have been if they had taken the Hood Canal Bridge. Judith Stone was working at the store that night. She remembered seeing the young couple. They came in looking for snacks and asked for directions. They were clearly lost. Stone told them they had missed the turn for the Hood Canal Bridge and were miles off track. She gave them directions to get back on the right route. Judith Stone remembered something else about that evening. Right after Jay and Tanya left the store, another man came in. He was young, wearing a brown rain slicker. Stone described him as rude and gruff in his manner. She noticed that Jay and Tanya had seemed to avoid this man. They had actively stayed away from him in the store. Stone could not have known how important this detail might be. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, Jay and Tanya stopped at Ben's Deli in Allen, Washington. A clerk there remembered seeing them. By this time, they were back on track toward Bremerton. The clerk said they did not have anyone else with them at that point. This was the last confirmed sighting of Jay and Tanya, where someone remembered seeing them alive and well. At 10:16 in the evening, someone purchased a ticket for the ferry from Bremerton to Seattle. This ferry ticket was later found in the van. The ferry would have left Bremerton around 10:20 and arrived in Seattle at approximately 11:35. Police believe Jay and Tanya took this ferry across Puget Sound to Seattle. After this ferry ride, Jay and Tanya vanished. Nobody saw them alive again. Jay and Tanya were expected home the next day, November 19th, 1987. When evening came on November 19th and they had not returned or called, their families started to worry. Tanya's father, William Van Kuylenberg, knew his daughter always called home if she was going to be late. Always. When she did not call that evening, her mother Jean became worried. William tried to stay calm for his wife's sake. He tried to reassure himself that everything would be okay. Maybe they had car trouble. Maybe they decided to stay an extra day. But when November 20th arrived, and there was still no word from Tanya or Jay, both families knew something was terribly wrong. They reported the couple missing to the police. On November 24th, 1987, a man was walking along a rural road in Skagit County, Washington. The road was called Parsons Creek Road. It was an isolated area near the small towns of Alger and Burlington, just south of Bellingham. The man was collecting aluminium cans along the roadside. The road sloped down into a ditch. As he looked into the wooded area beside the road, he saw something that made him stop. It was a young woman's body. The police were called immediately. When they arrived, they found Tanya Van Kuylenberg's body. She was lying in the ditch. She was naked from the waist down except for her white cotton socks. Her bra had been pushed up above her breasts. Her hands had been bound with plastic zip ties. She had been shot in the back of the head. The medical examiner determined she had been sexually assaulted before being killed. The cause of death was the gunshot wound. The gun used was a .38 caliber weapon. Plastic zip ties were found near Tanya's body. These were the kind of ties used to secure things, like the kind electricians use to bundle wires together. The presence of these ties suggested the killer had come prepared. He had brought supplies with him. This was planned. When Tanya's body was found, Jay was still missing. For a brief, terrible period, police considered the possibility that Jay might have killed Tanya. Both families rejected this idea completely. They knew Jay. They knew he would never hurt Tanya. They were right, but the families had to endure the pain of hearing their son and brother considered a suspect in his girlfriend's murder. On November 25th, 1987, Tanya's wallet and keys were found. They had been discarded near the Greyhound bus station in Bellingham, Washington. The bus station was on State Street, just a few blocks away, in a parking lot that had once belonged to a business called Blue Diamond. Police found Jay's father's van. The bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon was locked. It had been abandoned there. Inside the locked van, investigators found important evidence. There were plastic gloves. There were more plastic zip ties, the same kind that had been found near Tanya's body. There were various receipts, including the ticket from the Bremerton to Seattle ferry that confirmed the couple had taken that second ferry as investigators believed. The most important piece of evidence found in the van was a pair of black pants that belonged to Tanya. These pants would eventually help solve the case more than 30 years later. Also found near the Greyhound station, under the porch of a nearby tavern, were more items. Police discovered Tanya's wallet and keys there, along with a pair of surgical gloves and a half-empty box of .380 caliber handgun ammunition. All of these items painted a picture. The killer had brought supplies: gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, zip ties to bind victims, a gun with ammunition. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was planned. On November 26, 1987, which was Thanksgiving Day, a hunter was walking in a rural area of Snohomish County. The location was along Crescent Lake Road, near a bridge called High Bridge. The bridge crossed over the Snoqualmie River. The area was about 2 miles south of Monroe, Washington. It was also near the Washington State Reformatory's Honor Farm, a prison facility. The hunter saw something under the bridge that should not have been there. It was a body covered with a tattered blue blanket. The police were called. They found Jay Cook's body. He had been severely beaten. Rocks had been used to strike him in the head. He had been strangled with twine and 2 red dog collars. The strangulation was the cause of death. In a final act of cruelty, the killer had stuffed tissue and a pack of Camel cigarettes down Jay's throat. More plastic zip ties were found near Jay's body, the same type of ties that had been found near Tanya's body and in the van. The location where Jay's body was found was about 60 to 70 miles south of where Tanya's body had been discovered 2 days earlier. Police worked to understand the timeline and the geography. The van had been found in Bellingham, which was closer to where Tanya's body was found than to where Jay's body was found. This led investigators to believe that Jay had been killed first. The killer had murdered Jay, left his body in Snohomish County, then driven north with Tanya, assaulted and killed her in Skagit County, and then abandoned the van in Bellingham. The murders happened across 4 different Washington counties. King County, which includes Seattle, was where Jay and Tanya were believed to have been kidnapped. Skagit County was where Tanya's body was found. Whatcom County was where the van was found in Bellingham. Snohomish County was where Jay's body was found. This meant multiple law enforcement agencies had to coordinate on the investigation. Detectives tried to reconstruct what had happened. They believed Jay and Tanya had met their killer somewhere in Seattle, most likely on the Bremerton to Seattle ferry or shortly after arriving in Seattle. The killer asked them for a ride. The young couple, who were kind and trusting, agreed to give this person a ride. Once the killer was in the van with them, he took control of the situation. Based on the evidence, police believed the killer's primary target was Tanya. He wanted to sexually assault her. Jay was killed because he was in the way. He was an obstacle that needed to be removed. The sophistication of the crime suggested to investigators that this might not have been the killer's first murder. The way he controlled 2 victims at once, the supplies he brought with him, the knowledge of Washington geography, the attempts to hide evidence, all of this suggested someone who knew what he was doing. The investigation became one of the biggest cases the region had ever seen. Hundreds of people were interviewed. Everyone who knew Jay and Tanya was questioned. Police looked at anyone who might have had contact with them. They collected DNA samples from potential suspects. They followed every lead, no matter how small. In the months after the murders, something deeply disturbing happened. Both families began receiving greeting cards in the mail. These cards contained taunting messages that referenced the murders in graphic detail. The cards were signed by someone claiming to be the killer. The postmarks on the cards came from different cities, including Seattle, Los Angeles, and New York. The cards were analysed. The handwriting was distinctive. The writer used unusual phrases, including the expression, "Hallelujah, bloody Jesus." The cards caused additional pain to families who were already devastated. The case received significant media attention. The murders were featured on Unsolved Mysteries, a popular television show at the time. Police hoped the publicity would generate tips. They hoped someone would recognise the handwriting on the cards. They hoped someone would remember seeing Jay and Tanya with a stranger. They hoped someone would come forward with information. Tips did come in, but none led to the killer. In 2010, police announced they had found the person who wrote the greeting cards. He was a 78-year-old Canadian transient who suffered from mental health issues. Police interviewed him and determined he was not the killer. He had no connection to the murders at all. He had somehow learned details about the case, possibly from police reports or news coverage, and had sent the cards to the families. This man had added to the family's suffering for no reason other than his own disturbed impulses. In 1994, forensic scientists were able to extract a DNA profile from evidence found at the crime scene. Semen was found on Tanya's black pants, the ones discovered in the van. The semen did not match Jay Cook's DNA, it belonged to the killer. The DNA profile of this unknown person was dubbed Individual A by investigators. In 2003, this DNA profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's National Offender Database. CODIS contains DNA profiles from people who have been arrested or convicted of certain crimes. If Individual A had a criminal record and his DNA was in the database, the computer would find a match. There was no match. Individual A's DNA was not in CODIS. This meant the killer had no criminal record that required DNA to be collected, or he had never been caught for any crimes. This was incredibly frustrating for investigators. They had DNA evidence from the killer, but it led nowhere. In 1995, Snohomish County Detective Jim Scharf helped form a cold case team. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenberg became one of the team's first cases. Scharf would work on this case for more than 2 decades. The case became personal to him. He felt a responsibility to the families. He felt a duty to Jay and Tanya. He never gave up. Over the years, more than 200 potential suspects were investigated. Every lead was followed. DNA samples were collected from anyone who seemed remotely connected to the case. Every single sample was tested and compared to individual A's profile. None matched. The case remained cold. Years passed. The 1990s came and went. The 2000s came and went. Jay's parents, Gordon and Leona Cook, learned to live with their grief. They talked about Jay often, but they tried to remember him in happy, friendly, joking terms. They tried to heal. Jay's sisters grew up without their brother. Tanya's brother, John Van Cuylenberg, became the family's main contact with investigators. John's parents were never the same after Tanya's death. William Van Cuylenberg died in May 1997 without ever knowing who killed his daughter. He was 61 years old. Jean Van Cuylenberg, Tanya's mother, lived until March 2020. She died at the age of 87, also without seeing the case fully resolved. In 2008, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office created a deck of playing cards featuring cold cases. Each card had information about an unsolved murder. The cards were distributed to prisoners in county jails and state prisons. The hope was that inmates might have information about these cases. Jay and Tanya's case was featured on one of the cards. In April 2018, police took a new approach. They contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company in Reston, Virginia, that specialized in advanced DNA technology. Parabon offered a service called snapshot DNA phenotyping. This technology could predict what a person looked like based on their DNA. Using the DNA from individual A, Parabon created composite sketches showing what the suspect might have looked like at ages 25, 45, and 65. The sketches showed a white male with specific facial features. These sketches were released to the public on April 11, 2018, in hopes that someone would recognize the person. But Parabon offered something even more powerful than DNA phenotyping. They offered genetic genealogy services. This was a revolutionary new technique for solving cold cases. In 2015, a woman named Chelsea Rustad from Tumwater, Washington, uploaded her DNA to GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a public website where people can upload their DNA data to find relatives and learn about their family history. Rustad was interested in genealogy. She wanted to discover other branches of her family tree. She wanted to find distant cousins and learn about her ancestry. She had no idea that her decision to upload her DNA would help solve a double murder. GEDmatch works by comparing DNA profiles. When someone uploads their DNA, the website compares it to all the other DNA profiles in the database. If 2 people share segments of DNA, it means they are related. The more DNA they share, the closer the relationship. Parents and children share about 50% of their DNA. First cousins share about 12.5%. Second cousins share about 3.1%. Third cousins share less than 1%. Even very distant relatives share tiny fragments of DNA. In 2018, Parabon uploaded the DNA profile of individual A to GEDmatch. The database at that time contained about 1 million DNA profiles. The computer searched through all of them, looking for matches. It found 2 people who shared enough DNA with individual A to be distant relatives. These 2 people were second cousins to individual A. C.C. Moore was the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. She was an expert at building family trees using DNA matches. Moore had worked on the PBS series Finding Your Roots and had helped many people discover their family history. Now she was using her skills to help solve crimes. C.C. Moore logged into GEDmatch and looked at the 2 distant relatives of individual A. She began building family trees for both of them. She worked backward through the generations, finding their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. Eventually, she found where the 2 family trees intersected. There was a common ancestor. By working forward from that common ancestor through all the descendants, Moore could narrow down who individual A might be. The process that could take weeks or months took Cece Moore only 2 hours. In just 2 hours of work, she had traced the family trees and identified a likely suspect. The maternal line and the paternal line intersected in a family from Woodinville, Washington. The family name was Talbot. The Talbots had only one son. His name was William Earl Talbot II. People called him Bill. William Talbot had been born in 1963. In November 1987, when Jay and Tanya were murdered, Talbot was 24 years old. He grew up in the Woodinville area. The location where Jay Cook's body was found was only about 7 miles from where Talbot's parents lived. Talbot had never been on law enforcement's radar. His name had never come up in the investigation. Police had never heard of him before. Detective Scharf and his team verified the information. William Talbot had no significant criminal record. He had worked as a truck driver. He lived in SeaTac, Washington, a city near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Now, investigators needed to get a DNA sample from Talbot to compare it to the DNA from the crime scene. Detectives put Talbot under surveillance. They followed him as he went about his daily routine. They waited for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample without alerting him to the investigation. This is called collecting cast-off DNA. If someone throws away a cup they drank from, or a cigarette they smoked, or any item that might have their saliva or other biological material on it, that item can be collected and tested. On May 17, 2018, detectives got their opportunity. Talbot was driving his truck in South Seattle. He was stopped at a traffic light. A paper coffee cup fell out of his truck. An undercover officer immediately swooped in and collected the cup. This was the break investigators had been waiting for. The coffee cup was rushed to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins tested the saliva on the cup and extracted a DNA profile. She compared it to the DNA profile of individual A from the crime scene. It was a match. The DNA on William Talbot's coffee cup matched the DNA found on Tanya Van Cuylenburg's pants. The statistical probability of finding another person with the same DNA profile was 1 in 180 quadrillion. For all practical purposes, it was certain. William Talbot was individual A. On May 17, 2018, after his shift at work, William Earl Talbot II was arrested as he left his trucking job in Seattle. He was taken into custody without incident. The next day, May 18, 2018, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce the arrest. Detective Jim Scharf stood at the press conference with tears in his eyes. He had worked on this case for over 20 years. He had never given up hope. Now, finally, there were answers. Scharf said that without genetic genealogy, they would not be standing there that day. The case would never have been solved. Jay's mother, Leona Cook, spoke at the press conference. Her voice was emotional. She said the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, they were close to closure. On the other hand, they were still at a loss. She did not have her only son, Jay. He was still gone. Jay's sister, Laura Banstra, also spoke. She could barely contain her emotions. She said it was hard to put into words the feeling of relief, of joy, of great sorrow that the arrest brought. She thanked the detectives and investigators who never gave up on the case. She said that yesterday, the killer had his last sleep in his own bed, his last coffee break, his last day of freedom. Tanya's brother, John Van Cuylenburg, spoke as well. He said Jay and Tanya were both gentle souls, caring and trusting kids. They were betrayed. John said his parents were never the same after Tanya's death. His father had died without answers. His mother was still alive, but the case had haunted the family for more than 30 years. William Talbot was charged with 2 counts of first-degree aggravated murder. He pleaded not guilty. His bail was set at $2 million. Talbot refused to talk to investigators. He said nothing about the case. Police had no idea what his motive had been. They were not even sure exactly how he had met up with Jay and Tanya. The trial began in June 2019 in Snohomish County Superior Court in Everett, Washington. William Talbot was 56 years old at the time. His defense attorneys were Rachel Ford and John Scott. The prosecutors were from the Snohomish County Prosecutor's Office. The trial was historic. It was the first time in the United States that a murder case solved through genetic genealogy went to trial. The Golden State Killer case in California had been solved using genetic genealogy a few weeks before Talbot's arrest, but that case did not go to trial because the defendant pleaded guilty. Talbot's trial would be the first jury trial in a genetic genealogy case. The prosecution presented their evidence. They showed the jury the DNA evidence. They explained how William Talbot's DNA matched the DNA from the crime scene. They presented the zip ties found at multiple locations. They showed the evidence of sexual assault. They explained that Talbot had lived just 7 miles from where Jay's body was found. They argued that Talbot had murdered both Jay and Tanya. The defense attorneys argued that there was insufficient evidence to prove Talbot guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They suggested that the DNA could be explained by consensual sex between Talbot and Tanya. They argued that just because Talbot's DNA was present did not prove he committed murder. Talbot did not testify during the trial. He sat quietly in the courtroom, listening to the evidence against him. The jury deliberated for several hours. On June 28, 2019, they returned with their verdict. William Earl Talbot II was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. When the verdict was read, Talbot reportedly flinched and gasped. John Van Cuylenburg said it felt great to finally have some answers. It had been such a long wait for all of them. On July 24, 2019, William Talbot was sentenced. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentences were to be served consecutively, meaning one after the other. In the courtroom for the sentencing were John Van Cuylenburg, Jay's parents Gordon and Leona, and Jay's sisters Laura and Kelly. The only person present from Talbot's family was Chelsea Rustad, his second cousin. Her DNA had helped identify him. She sat between John Van Cuylenburg and Gordon Cook during the sentencing. She said she was happy to support the victim's family. She said she did not feel conflicted about the fact that her DNA helped convict her cousin. The nature of the crime was too horrific for her to feel any other way. At the sentencing, William Talbot gave a brief, forceful speech asserting his innocence. He said the level of violence in the case was something he could not comprehend. He maintained that he did not commit these murders. After the sentencing, the families tried to move forward. They had waited 31 years for this moment. Jay and Tanya had been killed in 1987. Now it was 2019. So many years had passed. So much had changed. But finally, there were answers. Finally, someone had been held accountable. However, the case was not over. William Talbot appealed his conviction. He argued that his constitutional right to an impartial jury had been violated. During jury selection, a woman identified as Juror 40 had been questioned about her ability to be fair and impartial. This juror had told both the prosecution and defense that her mother had experienced domestic abuse. When asked if that would affect her ability to be fair and impartial, she said she honestly felt like she would not know until the time came. She also said she had a daughter, and that might play a part in how she felt. If there was some action taken toward a young woman, she might take that personally and not be able to be impartial. The juror was asked if she could set her personal experiences aside and listen to the evidence. She said she would try. The defense attorneys had the option to dismiss this juror using what is called a peremptory challenge. Every side in a trial gets a certain number of peremptory challenges that allow them to dismiss potential jurors without giving a reason. The defense chose not to use one of their peremptory challenges to dismiss Juror 40. She was seated on the jury and participated in the deliberations that found Talbot guilty. On December 7, 2021, the Washington State Court of Appeals issued a ruling. They overturned William Talbot's conviction. The appeals court said that Juror 40 had exhibited actual bias during her comments in voir dire, which is the jury selection process. The court said they could not conclude that Juror 40 was sufficiently free of bias, such that Talbot was provided a fair and impartial jury. The conviction was reversed. William Talbot would need a new trial. The families were devastated. After all those years waiting, after the guilty verdict, after the sentencing, the conviction had been thrown out. The Snohomish County Prosecutor's Office said they were disappointed. They planned to appeal to the Washington State Supreme Court. The prosecutors filed their appeal before the January 5, 2022 deadline. The Washington State Supreme Court agreed to review the case. On December 22, 2022, the Washington State Supreme Court issued its decision. The 9 justices voted unanimously to reinstate William Talbot's conviction. The Supreme Court ruled that the defense attorneys had peremptory challenges available, but chose not to use one to dismiss Juror 40. The defense could have removed her from the jury but chose not to. Therefore, they could not claim on appeal that her presence violated Talbot's right to a fair trial. The guilty verdict was reinstated. John Van Cuylenberg said the Supreme Court ruling brought a sense of procedural justice. It never really brings closure, he said, but at least there was justice. It felt better than if it had gone the other way. William Earl Talbot II remains in prison serving 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He continues to maintain his innocence. The case remains closed. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenberg were just kids in love. They went on what was supposed to be a simple overnight trip to Seattle. They were kind and trusting. They probably offered a stranger a ride, trying to be helpful. That decision cost them their lives. For more than 30 years, their families lived without answers. The case became one of the most well-known unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest. The breakthrough in the case came from genetic genealogy, a technique that combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research. The success of this case and others like it has revolutionized cold case investigations across the United States. Dozens of cold cases have since been solved using genetic genealogy. The technique has proven that no case is too old to solve, as long as DNA evidence was preserved. Chelsea Rustad uploaded her DNA to GED Match, hoping to learn about her family history. She had no idea she had a cousin who was a murderer. She had no idea her DNA would help solve a double homicide from 1987. Her willingness to participate in genetic research, along with the willingness of millions of other people who uploaded their DNA to public databases, made it possible for investigators to identify William Talbot. The families of Jay and Tanya will never get their loved ones back. Jay will never become the marine biologist he dreamed of being. Tanya will never become the photographer she wanted to be. They will never grow old. They will never have children. They will never celebrate another birthday or holiday with their families. But at least now, their families know who killed them. At least now, that person is in prison. At least now, there are answers. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 5. Case number 5. Wendy Lorraine Camp was born on March 1st, 1969. She grew up on a large farm in Oklahoma. As a young girl, Wendy dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. She loved animals and enjoyed the farm life. When Wendy was 16 years old in 1986, she began dating a college student named Christopher Brito. Christopher was from another country, either Sri Lanka or Kuwait, depending on which records you look at. The young couple soon discovered that Wendy was pregnant. On January 17, 1986, Wendy gave birth to a daughter named Cynthia M. Brito. Wendy and Christopher got married. However, their marriage did not last long. When baby Cynthia was only 6 months old, Christopher's parents put pressure on him to end the marriage. They convinced him to divorce Wendy and return to his home country. Christopher agreed. He gave Wendy a divorce and left. Wendy, now a divorced teenage mother, returned to her family with her baby daughter. Her family welcomed them both with open arms. In the spring of 1987, Wendy was 18 years old. She got a job working at a local restaurant, possibly an ice cream parlor, in Edmond, Oklahoma. At this job, she met a young man named Chad No. Chad also worked at the restaurant. Wendy and Chad began dating. They worked together and spent time together. Before long, Wendy discovered she was pregnant again. Wendy and Chad got married in May 1988, about a month before their son was born. On June 1988, Wendy gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Jonathan No. After the wedding, Wendy and Chad moved in with Wendy's parents. This arrangement seemed to work well at first. Wendy's family helped take care of both Cynthia and baby Jonathan. But just 1 month after Jonathan was born, something terrible happened. Wendy's health began to decline rapidly. She was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis, often called MS, is a serious disease that affects the brain and spinal cord. It can cause many different symptoms, including weakness, difficulty walking, vision problems, and fatigue. For Wendy, the disease hit her hard and fast. Wendy's condition got worse and worse. She had to be hospitalized. Despite medical treatment, her health continued to deteriorate. A few months after being diagnosed, Wendy fell into a coma. She remained unconscious, unable to wake up, unable to care for her children, unable to do anything. She was completely helpless. While Wendy was in the hospital fighting for her life, arrangements had to be made for her children. Christopher Brito, Cynthia's father, agreed to let Wendy's family care for Cynthia during this time. Wendy's parents took care of their granddaughter. For baby Jonathan, Chad's mother Beverly No offered to help. Beverly said she would watch over Jonathan until Wendy recovered. But Chad did not wait for Wendy to recover. About 7 months after Wendy fell into the coma, Chad filed for divorce. His wife was lying in a hospital bed, unconscious and severely ill, and Chad decided to end their marriage. He also filed for custody of Jonathan. In the paperwork, Chad stated that because of Wendy's multiple sclerosis, he did not think she would be able to help him raise their child. He decided it was best if they got divorced, and he raised Jonathan on his own. Wendy was in no position to fight the divorce or the custody case. She was in a coma. She could not hire a lawyer. She could not appear in court. She could not defend herself. The divorce went through. Chad was granted custody of Jonathan. Wendy remained in a coma for approximately 16 months. When she finally woke up, she faced a long and difficult recovery. She had to relearn basic skills that most people take for granted. She had to learn how to eat again. She had to learn how to walk again. She had to learn how to communicate. She went through extensive therapy. The recovery process took more than a year. During her time in the hospital recovering, Wendy met someone. Friends introduced her to a man who was also at the hospital. His name was Leon Camp. Leon was kind and caring. He saw past Wendy's illness and disability. He saw the person she was. Wendy and Leon fell in love. Around 1990, they got married. Leon became Wendy's third husband. Everyone who knew Leon said he was a wonderful man. He was the type of person who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. He loved Wendy, and he was willing to deal with the stress and challenges of having a wife with multiple sclerosis. Leon treated Cynthia like his own daughter. Wendy, Leon and Cynthia lived together as a family in Oklahoma City. As Wendy's health improved, she began to think about her son Jonathan. She had lost custody of him while she was sick, but now she was doing better. She wanted to see her son. She wanted to be part of his life. She asked Chad if she could have visitation rights. At first, things went smoothly. Jonathan was allowed to spend a few weekends with Wendy, Leon and Cynthia. Jonathan got to know his mother and his half-sister. But according to Wendy's family, Chad's family soon began to interfere. They started sabotaging the visits. They made it difficult for Wendy to see Jonathan. During this time, Chad's life was falling apart. He had gotten involved with drugs. His drug habit got worse and worse. He also got multiple women pregnant, including some who may have been underage according to some sources. Because of his drug abuse and his behaviour, Chad's sister Kimberly initially took care of Jonathan for a while. When Kimberly moved to New York, Wendy's mother Jackie Taylor asked Beverly No, Chad's mother, to care for Jonathan. Beverly agreed. Beverly No was a complicated and difficult woman. She had a strong personality and seemed to want control over Jonathan. According to family members, Beverly worked hard to keep Jonathan essentially to herself. As Chad's drug problems continued, Beverly secretly went to court and was granted full custody of Jonathan. She became his legal guardian. This meant that Wendy had to go through Beverly if she wanted to see her own son. Wendy's family did not think highly of Chad or Beverly No. They blamed them for many of Wendy's problems. Some family members even believed that Wendy's multiple sclerosis had been caused, at least in part, by Chad giving her drugs while she was pregnant with Jonathan. Whether this was true or not, the bad feelings between the families ran deep. The situation became even worse when Chad and Beverly made a serious accusation. They went to authorities and claimed that Leon Camp had sexually abused Jonathan. This was a devastating allegation. Medical tests were performed on Jonathan. The tests found no supporting evidence of abuse. A court-appointed therapist named Ginger Leto investigated the claims and cleared Leon of all accusations. The court found that the abuse claims were false. Chad and Beverly were cited for contempt of court for making false accusations. The court ordered them to allow Wendy's visits with Jonathan to resume, but Chad and Beverly often refused to follow the court order. For more than 6 months, they would not let Wendy see Jonathan. Wendy was heartbroken. She missed her son. She wanted to be part of his life, but Chad and Beverly kept him away from her. Then, out of nowhere, something changed. On May 29, 1992, Chad called Wendy. He said that not only could she come see Jonathan, but that his mother Beverly would even pick her up and drive her to Shamrock where they lived. Shamrock, Oklahoma was about 115 miles northeast of Oklahoma City, a drive of more than 2 hours. Because Wendy had multiple sclerosis and was unable to drive, having Beverly offer to pick her up seemed helpful. Leon Camp did not like this sudden change. The offer came out of nowhere. After 6 months of refusing visits, why were they suddenly being so cooperative? Leon did not trust Chad. There was still a lot of anger and bad feelings between them, especially after the false abuse accusations. Leon did not want Wendy to go alone. He wanted to go with her. When Beverly arrived at their home on the morning of May 29, 1992, an argument happened. Leon said he wanted to come along. Beverly refused. She said that Leon and Chad would just end up arguing and maybe even fighting with each other. She would not let Leon come. Leon was worried. He did not want Wendy to go alone into a situation he did not trust. Leon came up with a solution. His sister, Lisa Renee Krieger, would go with Wendy. Lisa was 22 years old, born on October 18, 1968. She was married to a man named Michael Krieger. Lisa agreed to go along to keep Wendy company and to provide safety in numbers. 6-year-old Cynthia also wanted to go. She wanted to see her half-brother Jonathan, so it was decided that Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa would all make the trip together. Also in the car that morning was Beverly's mother, Ida Pruitt. Ida was an older woman with a reputation for being ruthless. Family members described her as someone who ran the family and was evil. Chadno himself would later testify that his grandmother Ida had mentioned a plan to kill Wendy Camp. He said she was the type of person who would stab you in the heart and watch you bleed to death. But on the morning of May 29th, nobody knew what Ida was really capable of. As the trio left the house, Leon gave Wendy a kiss goodbye. He watched as the car drove away. This was the last time he ever saw his wife, his daughter Cynthia, and his sister Lisa alive. The drive from Oklahoma City to Shamrock took just over 2 hours. The visit seemed to go okay. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Wendy called Leon on the phone. She told him they were on their way home. She said they would be back around 7 or 7:30 that evening. Leon said okay. He expected them home for dinner. But 7 o'clock came and went. Then 7:30 passed. Then 8 o'clock. Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa did not come home. They did not call. By midnight, Leon was very worried. Wendy had multiple sclerosis and needed to take her medication regularly. She had not taken her medication with her because she thought this was just a day trip. Leon knew that Wendy would have called if there was any delay. She always called. Always. The fact that he had not heard from her meant something was very wrong. Leon called Wendy's parents. They were also worried. On May 30th, 1992, the family filed a missing persons report with the police. Wendy Camp, age 23, her daughter Cynthia Brito, age 6, and Lisa Renee Krieger, age 22, were officially reported missing. Law enforcement began investigating immediately. They interviewed everyone involved. They talked to Chad No. They talked to Beverly No. They talked to Ida Pruitt. Beverly and Ida told investigators the same story. They said that during the drive back to Oklahoma City, Wendy got into an argument with them. They said Wendy was complaining about how difficult it was to get visitation with Jonathan. The arguing continued for some time. According to Beverly and Ida got tired of the arguing. She asked Beverly to drop her off at her house around 5:15 in the afternoon. Beverly supposedly dropped Ida off and then continued driving with Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa. Beverly claimed that the arguing continued even after Ida got out. Finally, Beverly said she got tired of listening to Wendy complain. She pulled into a Walmart parking lot in Chandler, Oklahoma. Chandler was about 45 miles from Oklahoma City. Beverly claimed she ordered all 3 of them out of the car right there in the Walmart parking lot. She said they got out and she drove away. She said she thought they could find a ride home or call Leon from the Walmart. Police investigated Beverly's story carefully. They went to the Walmart in Chandler. They interviewed every single person who worked at that store. They interviewed people at neighbouring businesses. They showed pictures of Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa. They asked if anyone had seen these 3 people on May 29, 1992. Nobody had seen them. Not one person. There was no evidence that Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa had ever been to that Walmart. Beverly's story appeared to be a lie. Investigators also interviewed Chad No. Chad told them what happened during the visit. He described the day. He said that when it was time for them to leave, he saw Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa getting into the car to go home. He never saw them again after that. Chad was given a polygraph test, which is sometimes called a lie detector test. The results showed he was being truthful. Police did not believe Chad was involved in whatever happened to the 3 women. The case became a major investigation. Police searched the 5-county area looking for any sign of Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa. They used airplanes to search from the air. 4 to 5 airplanes searched the area, looking for any clues. They found nothing. No sign of the women, no sign of a vehicle, nothing. As the days passed, the situation became more desperate. Wendy needed her medication. Her life was in danger without it. The family knew that if Wendy was alive somewhere, she was suffering. A week into the search, the media was notified. News coverage of the missing women spread across Oklahoma. A reward of $5,000 was offered for tips that could help find them. The case was featured on the television show UNSOLVED Mysteries. This was a popular program that highlighted unsolved crimes and missing persons cases. The show interviewed people connected to the case. Ida Pruitt appeared on the show. On camera, she said Beverly and I did not have nothing to do with their disappearance. She said, "I know this." But investigators thought her manner was strange. It seemed like she was trying to minimize any involvement she might have had. As police dug deeper into the backgrounds of Beverly and Ida, they learned some disturbing information. Years earlier, Ida and her daughter Debbie had been arrested when Debbie's husband was stabbed to death. They were released due to lack of evidence. The murder was never solved. But within the family, people made comments suggesting that Ida, and possibly Debbie, had been involved. Chadno's cousin, Kirsten Leading Fox, would later say that Ida was ruthless and did not have any problem committing crimes. Meanwhile, Beverly No went into hiding. For about a year after the disappearance, nobody could find Beverly. She had disappeared along with Jonathan. Eventually, she surfaced, and the court ordered her to let Wendy see Jonathan. But of course, Wendy was gone. The court did not demand that Beverly return Jonathan to Wendy's family, which mystified and angered them. Police continued to work the case for a year. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed up on every tip that came in from the Unsolved Mysteries episode, but every lead turned into a dead end. No evidence contradicted Beverly's story, even though nobody believed it. Without bodies, without witnesses, without physical evidence, the case eventually went cold. The years passed. 1992 turned into 1993, then 1994, then 2000, then 2010. Wendy's mother, Jackie Taylor, never gave up hope, but as time went on, it became harder to believe they would ever find out what happened. In September 2011, Ida Pruitt died of cancer. She was 82 years old. The family hoped that on her deathbed, Ida might confess to what she and Beverly had done. She never did. She took her secrets to the grave. In 2013, something finally broke the case open. Beverly No's brother, Grover Pruitt Jr., came forward. Grover was 60 years old. For 21 years, he had lived with suspicions about what his mother and sister had done. Finally, he could not live with it anymore. In March 2013, he reached out to investigators from the Creek County District Attorney's Office. Grover told them he had suspicions that Ida and Beverly might have had something to do with the girls being missing. He said there was a property near Jennings, Oklahoma, in Pawnee County, that his mother used to own. On that property, there was a hole in the ground. The hole had originally been dug for a septic tank. A septic tank is an underground chamber used for wastewater. The hole had been dug months before the women disappeared in 1992. According to Grover, his mother Ida had lived in a trailer on the property. She had the hole dug for a septic tank that she planned to install, but the hole sat there empty for a while. It became a place where trash was dumped. The hole stayed uncovered and unused. Then, shortly after Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa went missing, something changed. Ida told Grover to have someone fill in the hole. She told him to cover it with dirt. Grover later remembered that his mother asked him to sprinkle black pepper on the area after it was filled. Black pepper was supposed to mask any smells that might come from the ground. It was supposed to keep dogs from sniffing around the area. Grover had filled in the hole as his mother asked, but he never looked inside because he was too afraid of what he might see. For years, he suspected what might be in that hole. After Ida died in 2011, Grover began telling acquaintances that he suspected his mother and sister had killed the missing women. He said he believed the bodies were buried in the septic tank hole. These comments eventually reached police. When investigators interviewed Grover in 2013, he was serious. He looked them in the eye and said they needed to look in that hole. He led them to the property near Jennings. The property was about 20 miles north of Shamrock and about 30 miles from Chandler. It was rural land, isolated and quiet. On April 15, 2013, investigators from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation began excavating the site. They dug carefully and slowly under the supervision of forensic anthropologist Angela Berg. They wanted to preserve any evidence they found. The hole was 8 feet deep, filled with dirt. On April 16, 2013, the digging uncovered something: skeletal remains. As they continued excavating, they found the remains of 3 bodies. The remains were buried deep in the ground, right where Grover had said they would be. The positioning of the bodies told a terrible story. Wendy Camp and Lisa Krieger appeared to have been placed in the ground first. Then 6-year-old Cynthia had been placed on top of them. Cynthia's remains still had duct tape attached to them. The duct tape had been wrapped around her eyes, nose and mouth. She had been bound at the wrists and ankles. Investigators realised that the killer did not want the child to see what was happening. The killer did not want to hear her scream. Along with the remains, investigators found other items in the grave. There was a Ruger revolver that appeared to be a .357 caliber handgun. There were 2 kitchen knives. These were the weapons used to kill Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa. The remains were taken to the state medical examiner's office. Careful analysis began. Dental records and medical records were used to try to identify the victims. DNA testing was performed. The clothing found on the skeletal remains matched the descriptions of what Wendy, Cynthia and Lisa had been wearing when they disappeared. Everything pointed to these remains being the 3 missing women. On May 2, 2013, based on the discovery of the remains, Grover Pruitt Jr. was arrested. He was charged with accessory after the fact to first-degree murder. The charge was for his role in concealing the fact that the 3 had been murdered and their bodies had been dumped in the hole. He had filled in the grave. He had helped cover up the crime for 21 years. Grover was booked into Creek County Jail on a bond of $500,000. The arrest of Grover made the news. The families of the victims learned that after 21 years, the remains of their loved ones had finally been found. Jackie Taylor, Wendy's mother and Cynthia's grandmother, was overcome with emotion. On one hand, she was relieved to finally know what happened. On the other hand, the confirmation that they were dead was devastating. She had lost hope over the years, but there had always been a tiny possibility that they were alive somewhere. Now that possibility was gone. The medical examiner performed autopsies on the remains. The cause of death for Wendy Camp was determined to be gunshot wounds and stab wounds. She had been shot multiple times. She had also been stabbed multiple times with a knife. Lisa Krieger died from gunshot wounds to the torso. She had been shot several times. For 6-year-old Cynthia Brito, the medical examiner could not determine an exact cause of death because of the condition of the remains. The cause was listed as homicidal violence of unspecified means. Wendy's sister Aisha later said she could not stop thinking about how Cynthia died. The not knowing made everything worse. On January 10, 2014, the results of DNA testing came back. The DNA confirmed the identities. The remains were positively identified as Wendy Camp, Cynthia Brito, and Lisa Renee Krieger. Now that the identities were confirmed and the deaths were ruled homicides, it was time to arrest the person responsible. Beverly No was 67 years old in January 2014. On the morning of January 10, 2014, investigators made a traffic stop about 1 mile west of Drumright, Oklahoma. They arrested Beverly No and charged her with 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was booked into Creek County Jail in Sapulpa. The arrest brought mixed emotions to the families. At a press conference, family members spoke about their relief and their pain. Jonathan No, who was now an adult, had been living with his grandmother Beverly for his entire life. He was shocked and confused. He had a lot going through his mind. He had just learned that the grandmother who raised him was accused of murdering his mother, his half-sister, and his aunt. Investigators believed they understood the motive for the murders. Beverly No did not want Wendy Camp to have custody of Jonathan. Beverly had essentially raised Jonathan since he was a baby. She saw him as her son, not her grandson. She did not want to lose him. According to the theory, Beverly and her mother Ida decided to kill Wendy to make sure she could never get Jonathan back. Cynthia and Lisa were collateral damage. They were witnesses who had to be eliminated. Beverly's ex-husband, Gary No, had provided information to investigators. He told them that before the murders, Beverly had said that getting custody of Jonathan would not be a problem if that bitch Wendy was not involved. This suggested premeditation. This suggested Beverly had been planning to get rid of Wendy. At a preliminary hearing in June 2014, 6 witnesses testified against Beverly No. One of those witnesses was her brother, Grover Pruitt. Grover testified that Beverly told him she had used a .357 caliber revolver in the murders, and that she threw it in the hole with the bodies. This matched the physical evidence. A Ruger revolver that appeared to be a .357 had been found with the remains. In April 2013, Grover had worn a recording device and met with Beverly at a casino. On the recording, Beverly said she had used the .357 and that she threw it in the hole. This conversation was played in court. The evidence against Beverly was strong. Chad No also testified at the hearing. He testified about the bad feelings and resentment between the families. He said his grandmother Ida had mentioned a plan to kill Wendy Camp. He described Ida as someone who ran the family and was evil. Marty Wilson, a special agent with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, testified about the investigation and the evidence. He explained that based on the number of knife wounds Wendy suffered, investigators believed she was the primary target. Wilson also testified about what Beverly had told an investigator regarding Cynthia. Beverly apparently said that Cynthia was killed because Ida Pruitt believed the child was damaged goods, because of the false molestation allegations they had made about Leon. The judge ruled that there was enough evidence for Beverly No to stand trial on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Her attorney, Dennis James, argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial, but the judge disagreed. Beverly No would have to face a jury. As the case moved forward toward trial, prosecutors faced a difficult decision. The evidence was strong, but it was also old. The crime had happened 22 years earlier. The main witnesses who could testify about what Beverly and Ida did were dead. Ida herself was dead. The physical evidence was solid, but would it be enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? Prosecutors were worried about losing at trial. If Beverly was found not guilty, she would walk free and could never be tried again. The families would get no justice at all. So the district attorney's office made a decision. They offered Beverly No a plea deal. The plea deal would reduce the charges from first-degree murder to accessory to murder. In exchange, Beverly would plead no contest to helping carry out the murders. A no contest plea means the defendant does not admit guilt, but agrees not to fight the charges. It has the same effect as a guilty plea in terms of sentencing. In January 2015, Beverly No accepted the plea deal. She appeared in court and pleaded no contest. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison plus 15 years of probation. The sentence was announced in court. Wendy's sister Aisha Hashmi was there. She wept as the sentence was read. She said she just wanted justice, and now she had what she wanted, even though it felt like Beverly got away with too much. Many family members were angry about the plea deal. They felt Beverly deserved to spend the rest of her life in prison for what she did. They felt that killing 3 people, including a 6-year-old child, should result in a much harsher punishment. But the prosecutors explained they had made the best decision they could to ensure Beverly faced some consequences rather than risking her walking free. Beverly No went to prison, but she did not serve her full sentence. Due to her age and health issues, she was released after serving only 3 years. On January 7, 2020, Beverly No walked out of prison a free woman. She had been convicted of being an accessory to the murders of Wendy Camp, Cynthia Brito, and Lisa Kregier. She had served just 3 years. The families were devastated. Grover Pruitt Jr. also faced charges. At his hearing, he was offered leniency in exchange for his cooperation with authorities. His case was resolved separately from Beverly's. Chad No was never charged with any crime related to the murders. Investigators did not believe he was directly involved in killing Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa. However, his role in creating the situation that led to their deaths, through the custody battle and the false accusations, left many questions. The families finally had their answers after 21 years of waiting. They knew where Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa were. They knew what happened to them. They knew who killed them. But the answers brought pain along with closure. The knowledge of how they died, especially little Cynthia with the duct tape over her face, was almost too much to bear. Wendy Camp had fought so hard to recover from multiple sclerosis. She had been in a coma for 16 months. She had to relearn how to walk, how to eat, how to communicate. She had found love again with Leon. She had been trying to be a good mother to both of her children. All she wanted was to see her son Jonathan. That simple wish had cost her life. and the lives of her daughter and sister-in-law. Cynthia Brito was only 6 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She went on that trip just wanting to see her half-brother. She was an innocent child caught up in adult conflicts she could not understand. The image of her bound and blindfolded, unable to see or scream, is heartbreaking. Lisa Renee Kregier was 22 years old. She was Leon's sister. She agreed to go on the trip to keep Wendy company, to provide safety in numbers. She was doing a favour for her brother and sister-in-law. She had no connection to the custody dispute. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her husband, Michael Krieger, lost his wife for no reason other than she was a witness. The case Beverly No could not stand the thought of losing Jonathan. She had raised him since he was a baby. She saw him as her child. When Wendy started to get better and wanted her son back, Beverly saw it as a threat. Rather than work through the legal system, rather than accept that Jonathan's mother had a right to be in his life, Beverly chose murder. The fact that Beverly and apparently her mother Ida were willing to kill a 6-year-old child shows how cold and calculating they were. They knew Cynthia had done nothing wrong. She was just a little girl. But she was a witness, so they killed her too. The duct tape over her face suggests they knew what they were doing was wrong. They did not want to see her face. They did not want to hear her cry. For Leon Camp, the loss was enormous. He lost his wife. He lost his little stepdaughter Cynthia. He lost his sister. All in one day. He had kissed Wendy goodbye that morning and never saw her again. He spent 21 years not knowing what happened to them. 21 years of wondering. 21 years of hoping they might still be alive. 21 years of pain. The case remained unsolved for so long because Beverly and Ida were smart about how they covered it up. They disposed of the bodies in a remote location on private property. They filled in the grave and covered it with dirt and black pepper. They stuck to their story about dropping the women off at Walmart. Without physical evidence or witnesses, police could not prove they were lying. What finally broke the case was Grover Pruitt's conscience. For 21 years he lived with the knowledge of what was buried on that property. He had filled in the hole. He knew. When his mother died in 2011, he started talking about his suspicions. Eventually, he could not live with it anymore. He came forward and told investigators where to dig. His cooperation solved the case. The murders of Wendy Camp, Cynthia Brito, and Lisa Kregier were solved through determination, persistence, and finally a break from someone on the inside. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation never gave up on the case. Even after 21 years, they continued to follow leads. When Grover came forward, they took him seriously. They dug where he told them to dig. They found the bodies. They brought the case to a resolution. While Beverly No served only 3 years in prison and Ida Pruitt died before facing justice, the case was solved. The families got their answers. They got to bring Wendy, Cynthia, and Lisa home. They got to give them proper burials. After more than 2 decades of not knowing, they finally knew the truth. It was not the justice they wanted, but it was more than they had before. The long wait was over. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the final case of the video, case number 6. Judith Lord, who went by the name Judy, was born as the 11th child in a family of 14 children. She grew up in Maine during her childhood. When Judy was young, her family moved from Maine to New Hampshire. Life in a large family meant Judy had many brothers and sisters around her. She was known as a kind person who loved music. Judy played the guitar and enjoyed playing it often. When Judy was a young woman, she met a man named Gregory Lord. Gregory was home on military leave when they met in New Hampshire. They fell in love and got married. After they married, Judy moved to Germany with Gregory because of his military service. While living in Germany, Judy gave birth to a son. They named the baby Gregory Lord Jr. after his father. Around 1974, the family moved back to the United States. They settled in Concord, New Hampshire. Concord is the capital city of New Hampshire. The family lived at an apartment complex called Concord Gardens. The complex was located in the Concord Heights neighborhood. Judy, her husband Gregory Sr., and their baby son lived together in Building 19, Apartment 4. But the marriage between Judy and Gregory Sr. was not happy. There were problems. In early May 1975, Gregory Sr. physically assaulted Judy. He hit her. After this assault, Gregory moved out of the apartment. He went to live with his grandmother, who lived across the road from Concord Gardens. When Gregory moved out, he took almost all of the furniture with him. He left Judy with only a bed and a crib for the baby. This meant Judy had very little furniture in the apartment. At the time of the assault and separation, Gregory Jr. was about 20 months old. Some reports say he was 17 months old, but most sources say he was around 20 months when his mother died. Either way, he was a toddler, not even 2 years old yet. Because of all the problems with her marriage, Judy decided to quit her job. She had been working at McCurley's nursing home. A nursing home is a place where elderly people live and get care. Judy worked there, probably helping to take care of the elderly residents. But with everything happening in her personal life, she stepped away from this job. Even though Judy was going through a difficult time, she tried to stay positive. In the short time she had lived at Concord Gardens before her death, she made many friends. Her neighbours liked her. People said she was very popular in the apartment complex. Neighbours often saw Judy sitting on the front steps of her building playing her guitar, while her little son played on the lawn nearby. This image of Judy playing music while watching her child showed what kind of mother she was. Judy also had a neighbour in the building who lived right next door to her apartment. His name was Ernest Theodore Gable. People called him Ernie. Ernest Gable was 24 years old in 1975. He lived in the apartment next to Judy's with his wife, whose name was Linda. The walls of their apartments were connected. They shared a wall between their two units. Ernest Gable was not a good man. He had a criminal record, which means he had been arrested before for committing crimes. The Concord Police Department knew who he was because he had been in trouble with the law multiple times. He had been arrested for breaking and entering, which means breaking into buildings. He had been arrested for possession of a dangerous weapon. He had also been arrested for possession of drugs. So Gable was someone the police already knew about, but Gable's criminal record was not the worst thing about him. He had a pattern of violence, especially violence against women. Multiple women had reported that Gable had tried to strangle them or kill them during sexual acts that were not consensual. Non-consensual means the women did not agree to what was happening. These acts were rape. Gable had a history of sexual violence and trying to strangle women. Judy Lord was afraid of Ernest Gable. She had told people about her fear. She told her friends and neighbours that she was scared of him. Gable had made sexual passes at Judy, meaning he had tried to start sexual relationships with her or made sexual comments to her. Judy was not interested. She had told him no, but Gable did not stop. Her sister later told investigators that Judy feared his repeated unwanted sexual advances. One person who knew Gable reported hearing him make a disturbing comment about Judy. This person heard Gable say about Judy Lord that someday he was going to get him a piece of that white meat. This racist and sexual comment showed how Gable viewed Judy. He saw her as something he wanted to take, not as a person. Ernest Gable was African American, and Judy Lord was white. His comment combined both racial and sexual elements in a deeply disturbing way. On the night of May 19, 1975, there was a volleyball game at the Concord Gardens apartment complex. Volleyball games were held in a common area where residents could gather and play together. Judy went to watch or participate in the volleyball game that evening. It was a normal community activity at the apartment complex. After the volleyball game ended, Judy and some other neighbours went to the apartment where Ernest Gable lived with his wife Linda. Linda was hosting a small gathering. People came over to hang out. Ernest Gable was not there when the gathering started. He was somewhere else. Judy spent time at Linda's apartment with the other neighbours. Around 11:30 in the evening, Judy decided to go home. She left Linda Gable's apartment and headed back to her own apartment next door. Before she went inside, Judy asked another neighbour to walk with her to her unit. She told this neighbour that she felt worried for her safety. The neighbour agreed to walk with her. They went to Judy's apartment. Judy had left her door unlocked. The neighbour went inside first to check and make sure everything was okay. The neighbour looked around and gave Judy the all-clear signal that it was safe. Judy went into her apartment. That was the last time anyone besides Ernest Gable saw Judy Lord alive. The time was approximately 11:30 p.m. on May 19, 1975. Around midnight, neighbours heard the sound of water running. It sounded like someone was taking a shower. This was probably Judy getting ready for bed. She was likely in her bathroom taking a shower. Shortly before 1 a.m. on May 20th, Ernest Gable arrived back at the apartment complex. Neighbours saw him return. About half an hour later, around 1:30 in the morning, something terrible happened. Several neighbours woke up to the sound of a woman screaming. The screams came from Judy Lord's apartment. One neighbour reported hearing moaning sounds and banging sounds. Another neighbour positively identified the voice as Judith Lord's voice. This neighbour heard Judy yell out loud the words, "Leave me alone, leave me alone." Then suddenly the sound was muffled, as if someone had put a hand over her mouth to silence her. The screaming stopped abruptly. Everything went quiet. The whole disturbance lasted only a few minutes before silence returned to the building. Inside Judy's apartment, a violent and desperate struggle was taking place. Evidence later found at the scene showed what happened. A curtain had been torn down from the wall. The curtain rod was broken. Broken cigarettes were scattered on the floor and on the bed. An alarm clock had been knocked over and was lying upside down on the floor. The clock had stopped at 1:47 a.m. This told investigators what time the attack happened. Throughout the apartment, there were signs of fighting and struggle. Judy had been in her bathroom, probably just getting out of the shower. She was wet. She was naked, or mostly naked. Ernest Gable had entered her apartment somehow. He attacked her. The attack was both sexual and violent. Gable sexually assaulted Judy. He raped her. Then he strangled her to death. Gable used his hands to strangle Judy. He also used a blue plastic item to cover her face. This blue plastic item was described as a blue plastic sauna suit or a plastic-type garment. He pulled it over her head to suffocate her. Between the strangulation and the suffocation, Judy died. An autopsy would later show that she died from homicidal strangulation. Judy's little boy, Gregory Jr., was in another bedroom of the apartment during all of this. The toddler was in his crib. He was not harmed physically, but he was alone in the apartment with his murdered mother. After killing Judy, Ernest Gable left the apartment. He went back to his own apartment next door. Judy's body lay in her upstairs bedroom. Her son remained in his crib in the adjacent bedroom, crying. The morning of May 20th, 1975 passed. Baby Gregory continued to cry. Hour after hour the child cried. His mother did not come to get him. She could not come. She was dead in the other room. Around 12:20 p.m., which is about 20 minutes after noon, a man named Joseph McVeigh went to Judy's apartment. Joseph McVeigh was the operations manager for Concord Gardens Apartments. His job included collecting rent from the tenants. Judy's rent was overdue. She had not paid. McVeigh went to her apartment to collect the money she owed. McVeigh knocked on the door of apartment 4 in building 19. Nobody answered, but he could hear a baby crying inside. The crying was persistent. It did not stop. The baby had been crying for hours and hours. McVeigh knew something was wrong. He had the authority to enter the apartment, so he went inside. When McVeigh entered the apartment, he heard the baby still crying in one room. He went upstairs to the bedrooms. He found 22-year-old Judith Lord in an upstairs bedroom. She was lying on the bed. There was a blue plastic item covering her face. McVeigh removed the blue plastic from her face. He saw that she was not responsive. She was not breathing. She was dead. McVeigh immediately called the police. Officers from the Concord Police Department arrived at the scene. They found the signs of violent struggle throughout the apartment. They found the broken curtain rod, the scattered cigarettes, the stopped clock showing 1:47. They found Judy's body. In the adjacent bedroom, they found baby Gregory Jr. still in his crib. The little boy was unharmed physically, but he had been alone with his dead mother for more than 12 hours. The police began investigating immediately. They processed the crime scene carefully. Crime scene technicians spent over 2 days going through the apartment collecting evidence. They photographed everything. They looked for fingerprints. They collected physical evidence. Investigators found important evidence in the bedroom where Judy was killed. They found hairs on and near her body. They found 2 towels on the floor. These towels had stains on them. The stains were seminal fluid, which is the fluid that contains sperm. The killer had left his DNA at the crime scene. An autopsy was performed on Judy's body. An autopsy is an examination done by a medical examiner to determine how someone died. The medical examiner found scratches on Judy's face and neck. The autopsy confirmed that Judy had been sexually assaulted. She had been raped. The autopsy also showed that she died from strangulation. Someone had strangled her to death with their hands and also suffocated her with the plastic item. As police investigated, they interviewed neighbours. People told them about hearing the screams in the middle of the night. They told them about hearing Judy yell, "Leave me alone." People also told police that Judy had been afraid of her neighbour, Ernest Gable. Police looked at 3 possible suspects. One was Judy's estranged husband, Gregory Lord Sr. They investigated him carefully, but Gregory Sr. had an alibi. An alibi is proof that you were somewhere else when a crime happened. Gregory was able to prove where he was when Judy was killed. Also, there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. Police ruled him out as a suspect. They also looked at another neighbour besides Gable. This second neighbour was also excluded as a suspect because there was no evidence connecting him to the crime scene. That left Ernest Theodore Gable. Police had good reasons to suspect Gable. First, they found fingerprints on the outside of Judy's windows. These fingerprints matched Ernest Gable's fingerprints. This showed that Gable had been at Judy's windows. He had touched the outside of her windows. Second, multiple witnesses told police that Judy was afraid of Gable. She had told people this. She had expressed her fear just the day before her murder. This showed that there was tension between them and that Judy saw Gable as a threat. Third, people had heard Gable making sexual comments about Judy. The comment about getting a piece of that white meat showed his sexual interest in her and his view of her as an object. Fourth, Gable lived right next door. His apartment shared a wall with Judy's apartment. He had opportunity to commit the crime. Fifth, Gable had a criminal history and a history of violence against women, including strangulation attempts. Police wanted to collect physical evidence from Gable to compare with the evidence from the crime scene. They wanted to take samples of his hair and his blood and other bodily fluids, but Gable did not want to give them voluntarily. He refused to cooperate. This led to an important legal case. Police had to go to court to get permission to collect the samples from Gable. The case went all the way to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. The court case was called State versus John Doe because they did not want to use Gable's real name in public at that time. John Doe was Ernest Gable. The legal question was whether police could force someone to give samples of their hair, blood, and body fluids. The United States Supreme Court had already ruled in a case called Schmerber versus California in 1966 that investigators had to prove probable cause to a court before they could get a search warrant for body samples. Probable cause means they needed good evidence that the person committed the crime. In November 1975, the New Hampshire Supreme Court met in a closed session to hear arguments. Attorneys representing Gable argued that even if his hair and blood matched the general characteristics of what was found at the scene, other people might also match that profile. But the court looked at all the evidence. They decided that police did have probable cause. They ruled in early December 1975 that police could take samples from Gable. Gable was taken to New Hampshire Hospital. There, medical staff collected samples from him. They took hair samples, they took blood samples, they collected other bodily fluids. These samples were then sent to laboratories for testing. This court case created an important precedent in New Hampshire law. It established that law enforcement could obtain DNA samples and other bodily samples with a search warrant if they had probable cause. This is something investigators do routinely today in investigations, but in 1975 it was a new legal question. As one investigator later said, something that investigators do routinely every day in investigations, collect a sample, was made possible as part of the legacy of Judith Lord. The samples taken from Ernest Gable were sent to the FBI's forensic laboratory for testing. The FBI was considered the leading authority in forensic science at that time. One of the tests they did was microscopic hair comparison. This involved taking the hair samples from Gable and comparing them under a microscope to the 5 hairs that had been found at the crime scene on Judy's body. Microscopic hair comparison was considered the gold standard of pre-DNA forensics in 1975. Scientists would look at hairs under a microscope and try to determine if they came from the same person by examining their physical characteristics. The FBI was the leader in this type of analysis. On December 16, 1975, the FBI issued their report. The report said that the hairs found at the scene were microscopically different from Ernest Gable's hair samples. The FBI concluded that the hairs did not originate from Ernest Gable. According to the FBI's analysis, Gable could not have contributed the hairs found at the scene. This report created a huge problem for the investigation. Before the FBI report came back, investigators had been prepared to arrest and charge Ernest Gable with murdering Judith Lord. They had strong circumstantial evidence. They had his fingerprints on her windows. They had witnesses saying she feared him. They had his proximity as her next-door neighbour. They had his history of violence. They had blood typing that showed the seminal fluid on the towels matched Gable's blood type. Blood typing was another forensic technique used before DNA testing became available. Different people have different blood types like type A, type B, type AB, or type O. Some people also have Rh positive or Rh negative blood. Preliminary blood analysis of the seminal fluid found on the towels in Judy's bedroom showed that the killer had type B or type AB blood. Ernest Gable had type B blood. This was consistent with him being the killer, but this only narrowed it down somewhat, because other people also have type B blood. The fingerprints on the window, the blood type match, the witness statements, and all the circumstantial evidence pointed to Ernest Gable. Prosecutors have been ready to indict him and take him to trial for first-degree murder. An indictment is when a grand jury formally charges someone with a crime. But then the FBI report came back saying the hairs did not match Gable. This contradicted all the other evidence. This created what prosecutors felt was an insurmountable evidentiary hurdle. An evidentiary hurdle is an obstacle in proving a case. Prosecutors worried that if they took Gable to trial, his defense attorneys would show the jury the FBI report. The jury would see that the FBI, the most respected forensic lab in the country, said Gable's hair did not match the crime scene hair. The jury might conclude that Gable was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors feared they would lose the case. So even though investigators believed Gable was the killer, even though they had prepared to charge him, the case stalled. The FBI report created a barrier they felt they could not overcome. Without being able to explain why the FBI report was wrong, prosecutors did not move forward with charges. The investigation was effectively halted. The case went cold. Ernest Gable was never arrested for killing Judith Lord. He was never charged. He never went to trial. He walked free. After getting away with murder, Ernest Gable continued to commit crimes. He kidnapped his own 2 daughters in Fall River, Massachusetts. He eventually moved to Illinois and then to California. While living in Illinois, he committed armed robbery. He was arrested and convicted. He served time in prison in Joliet, Illinois for that armed robbery. After his release, Gable moved to Los Angeles, California. He started using a different name. He went by the alias Ernest Stanbury instead of Ernest Gable. He lived in Los Angeles using this fake name. On February 1st, 1987, Ernest Gable was 36 years old. He got into an argument with someone on the street in Los Angeles. During this argument, Gable was stabbed. The knife wound went into his chest. Ernest Theodore Gable died from that stab wound. He was murdered in the same city where he had been living under an assumed name. The man who strangled and killed Judith Lord in 1975 was himself killed by violence in 1987. Back in New Hampshire, the murder of Judith Lord remained officially unsolved. The case sat in the files. Years passed. By September 1985, New Hampshire had 38 official unsolved murders, including Judy Lord's case. Her murder was talked about in the community. People in Concord did not forget. Neighbours still asked about the case. The murder lived in the city's collective memory. In 2003, a state investigator named Todd Flanagan decided to reopen the murder case of Judith Lord. Flanagan was assigned to cold cases. A cold case is an unsolved crime that happened a long time ago. Flanagan looked at the evidence from 1975. By 2003, forensic science had advanced dramatically. DNA testing was now possible. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the genetic material inside cells that makes each person unique. DNA testing can identify people with incredible accuracy. The technology to analyze DNA had been developed in the 1980s and improved throughout the 1990s and 2000s. By 2003, it was a powerful tool for solving crimes. Todd Flanagan arranged for the physical evidence from Judith Lord's murder to be tested using modern DNA analysis. The 2 towels with semen stains from Judy's bedroom had been preserved as evidence for all these years. The New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory tested these towels using DNA analysis. The results came back. The DNA from the semen and sperm on both towels was analysed. This DNA was compared to samples that had been collected from Ernest Gable back in 1975. The DNA was a statistical match to Ernest Gable. The probability was calculated as 1 in 6.5 million within the population of African Americans. This meant that within the African American population, only about 1 in 6.5 million people would have DNA matching this profile. Ernest Gable was one of those people. This DNA evidence proved that Ernest Gable had left his semen at the crime scene. Combined with all the other evidence from 1975, it showed that Gable had sexually assaulted and murdered Judith Lord. But there was a problem. Ernest Gable was already dead. He had been killed in 1987. You cannot arrest a dead person. You cannot put a dead person on trial. Criminal charges can only be brought against living people. So even though investigators now had DNA proof that Gable was the killer, they could not prosecute him. The case continued to be worked on over the years. The New Hampshire Cold Case Unit kept pursuing it. They used advances in forensic science. They followed new leads. But without a living suspect to charge, the case remained technically unsolved. Then, in the 2000s, scientists and the FBI finally acknowledged that microscopic hair comparison was fundamentally flawed. For decades, this technique had been used in courtrooms across America. Expert witnesses from the FBI had testified in criminal trials that hair samples matched or did not match suspects. Juries had believed this testimony. People had been convicted based partly on hair comparison evidence, but research showed that microscopic hair comparison was not reliable. It was not scientifically valid. The technique involved too much subjective judgment by the examiner. Different examiners could look at the same hairs and reach different conclusions. There was no standardized method. The comparisons were not accurate. In 2015, the US Department of Justice and the FBI formally acknowledged this problem. They admitted that nearly every examiner in the FBI's microscopic hair comparison unit had provided flawed testimony or reports. These reports had overstated forensic matches in ways that favoured the prosecution. In some cases, innocent people may have been convicted because of bad hair analysis. In other cases, like Judith Lord's murder, guilty people may have escaped justice because of bad hair analysis. The FBI report from December 16, 1975, that said Ernest Gable's hair did not match the crime scene hair was wrong. The microscopic hair comparison that led to that conclusion was flawed science. The FBI examiner who analysed the hairs in the Judith Lord case was one of the many examiners who had provided flawed reports. The report that stopped prosecutors from charging Gable in 1975 should never have stopped them. It was based on discredited science. The New Hampshire Cold Case Unit conducted a comprehensive re-examination of the entire Judith Lord case file. They looked at all the evidence from 1975. They looked at the DNA results from the 2000s. They interviewed people again. They built a complete picture of what happened. By November 2025, exactly 50 years after the original FBI report that derailed the case, investigators were ready to make an announcement. They had conclusively identified Ernest Theodore Gable as the person responsible for Judith Lord's murder. On November 24th and 25th, 2025, New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella held a press conference. He was joined by New Hampshire State Police Colonel Mark Hall, Concord Police Chief Bradley Osgood, and members of the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. The Senior Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Cold Case Unit was R. Christopher Knowles. At the press conference, Attorney General Formella announced that after nearly 5 decades of investigation, the murder of Judith Lord had been solved. Ernest Theodore Gable was identified as her killer. The case would be formally closed and classified as solved. Formella said it was his hope that this long-awaited conclusion would finally bring peace and closure to Judy Lord's family and the entire Concord community after nearly 5 decades of delayed justice. He said this resolution proves that no cold case is ever truly closed until the truth is found. The original Concord Police Department investigators showed extraordinary diligence, only to be thwarted by flawed forensic technology of the era. Christopher Knowles explained how the case was solved. He talked about the DNA evidence that definitively linked Gable to the crime scene. He talked about the overwhelming circumstantial evidence from 1975, including the fingerprints, the witness testimony about Judy's fear, the sexual comments Gable made, and the screams neighbours heard. He talked about how the FBI's microscopic hair analysis had been wrong, and how modern DNA technology rectified that failing. Knowles said that based on all the evidence, if Ernest Gable were alive today, the cold case unit would pursue charges of first-degree murder against him. The charges would be for knowingly causing Judy Lord's death during the commission of aggravated felonious sexual assault, and for purposely causing her death by strangulation. But because Gable died in 1987, no arrest or prosecution would occur. The case was simply being closed as solved. Concord Police Chief Bradley Osgood said this was a significant day for the community. He said it was a case people still talked about, one that neighbours still asked about, one that had lived in the city's collective memory for decades. While the announcement could not erase the pain Judy's family had endured, it allowed the community to finally take a breath that it had been holding for a very long time. Concord had never forgotten Judy, and he hoped this day brought some measure of peace to the family. Several of Judy's family members attended the press conference. They had learned about the resolution just before the public announcement. Judy's son, Gregory Lord Jr., participated virtually. He was watching the press conference online. He sent a statement that was read at the conference. Gregory Lord Jr. said he did not remember his mother. He was only 20 months old when she was killed. He was young, but he always kept her memory inside his heart. She would always be with him. He was told he looked just like his mum, and he was proud of that. He said he had been through a lot in his life, and in the dark times, he had always thought of his mum. Judy's sister Joanne also released a statement. She recalled Judith as a kind person who loved her son. She remembered that Judy was an avid guitarist who played the instrument wherever she went. This matched what neighbours had said about Judy often playing guitar on the front steps, while her son played on the lawn. The press conference in November 2025 marked the end of a 50-year journey seeking justice for Judith Lord. The announcement brought closure to a case that had haunted Concord for half a century. The truth was finally known and publicly acknowledged. Ernest Theodore Gable murdered Judith Lord. He sexually assaulted her and strangled her to death in her own apartment, while her toddler son slept in the next room. He got away with it for 12 years before dying himself in 1987. The case of Judith Lord showed both the failures and the successes of the criminal justice system. It showed how flawed forensic science could derail a case. The FBI's microscopic hair analysis was considered the gold standard in 1975, but it was wrong. That wrong analysis allowed a killer to escape justice for the rest of his life. Ernest Gable was never punished for murdering Judy. He never spent a day in prison for her death. He lived free for 12 more years, committing more crimes, hurting more people. But the case also showed the dedication of investigators who never gave up. The original Concord Police Department investigators in 1975 did excellent work. They identified the right suspect. They collected the right evidence. They preserved that evidence properly. Their work was not in vain. Decades later, when technology caught up, their carefully preserved evidence proved them right. Todd Flanagan, the investigator who reopened the case in 2003, showed that cold cases are never truly closed. His decision to revisit the evidence using modern DNA testing was crucial. The New Hampshire Cold Case Unit's comprehensive review in the 2000s brought all the pieces together. They removed the flawed FBI report from consideration and looked at the totality of the evidence. They reached the correct conclusion. For Gregory Lord Jr., the resolution came 50 years after losing his mother. He grew up without her. He did not remember her, but he always carried her memory with him. Now he knew for certain who killed her and why. Now he knew that investigators had identified the truth, even if the killer never faced trial. For the community of Concord, particularly the Concord Heights neighbourhood where Concord Gardens stood, the case had been a shadow hanging over the area for half a century. People who lived there in 1975 remembered the murder. They remembered the young mother and her baby. They remembered the fear that followed. Now, 50 years later, they had answers. The murder of Judith Lord in 1975 was a tragedy. A 22-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her was brutally killed by her neighbour. A little boy lost his mother. A family lost a daughter and sister. Justice was delayed for 50 years because of faulty forensic science, but eventually the truth emerged. Modern DNA technology accomplished what 1975 technology could not. Ernest Theodore Gable was conclusively identified as the killer. The case was solved. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.